I hope everyone had a good break. We will now go right into our Delphi Methods, Challenges, and Opportunities session. This session will be moderated by Dr. Laura Lee Johnson. Dr. Johnson is the Division Director of the Division of Biometrics 3 in CEDAR. I will now turn it over to Dr. Johnson.
Thank you, Ethan, and thank you everyone for joining the second half of our workshop today. Over the course of our next two presentations and our panel discussion, we're going to explore some of the challenges and opportunities with these methods to be patient-centric. If you have questions, please place them in the Q&A box, and we'll answer some of those at the end of our session. First, we're going to hear two presentations. Ebony from BioMarin will set the stage with a quick overview of Delphi methodology to ground our session today. And then next, Holly from RTI will provide a couple of study examples. Ebony, please come on camera and begin. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all. Good afternoon. Go to the next slide. Next slide, please. So now it's time for us to go on a journey to understand the historical context and the evolution of Delphi methodology, including what Delphi methodology is and what it's not, the utility of Delphi methodology in patient experience data generation, and some advantages and limitations. Next slide. To begin, the Delphi method, also known as the Delphi process or Delphi technique, is a method of communication used to achieve expert group consensus. The original process was invented by the RAND Corporation in the 1950s to survey expert opinion, gather information, and forecast impact of new technologies on future defense policy. This original version of this technique is known as the classical Delphi method, as depicted on the left, where round 0 included expert idea generation. Then there are a minimum of 2 subsequent rounds of questionnaire administration among expert panelists. Answers could even be changed at round 2. This process then iterates for an additional 1 or 2 more rounds until consensus is reached. A statistical summary is also calculated at the end, with final opinions aggregated and percent agreement calculated. Key features of the classical method include anonymity, the iterative response cycle, gathering controlled feedback on responses after each round, and creating a statistical summary. Since the original classical method was created, new modified methods have evolved. Next slide. As you can see, the Delphi method has truly evolved over the years, first gaining popularity in far more sectors of applied and social sciences, but also evolving in practice with expansion of the preparation stage, for instance, the research settings, as well as how statements and questionnaires are drafted, the panelist selection phase, and how panels are actually run, whether synchronous, asynchronous, and the number of rounds to consensus. Analytic methods have also evolved to include both qualitative and quantitative components. As you can see on the right, we have highlighted 3 modernized Delphi methods that are now being used commonly. First, we have the policy Delphi, which is defined to explore a range of opinions on a given policy topic or issue to identify divergent views, and then arrive at potential solutions that can be agreed upon. Secondly, we have the modified Delphi approach, in which an initial anonymous ranking round is used to inform an in-person meeting. In the healthcare field, modified Delphi is frequently referred to as simply an expert panel. And key features of this Delphi method include a literature review requirement, a limited number of rounds, an in-person discussion round between 2 rounds of questions, which require a moderator, and use of a Likert type scale to measure consensus. Lastly, we have the e-Delphi method. E-Delphi or online Delphi panels are conducted using online surveys and have gained popularity over the past 20 years. Key features of e-Delphi include the use of online software like Expert Lens, which was created by RAND, a pre-specified number of rounds. For instance, in Expert Lens, there are 3 to 4 rounds. Round 0 input is synthesized into the close-ended questions that panelists answer in subsequent rounds. Panelists also get individualized reports and compare their responses with those of others to see if they've reached consensus. Finally, using e-Delphi allows for potential asynchronous partially anonymous, moderated discussion to work out points of disagreement. Ultimately, the Delphi method can be applied in multiple contexts and can exhibit varying mixtures of qualitative and quantitative techniques. And the format presented to the panel, together with the technique used to determine its outcomes, are what determine a particular panel's design. So be aware that a Delphi method approach should be carefully selected based on research objectives, and the choice of design elements may also be influenced by other contextual factors like time and budget. So researchers must consider options carefully as they design their studies. Next slide. I talked a lot about what the Delphi method is, and the fundamental commonality across all of the techniques are iteration, feedback, and consensus. We can't confuse this with other qualitative methods though, because Delphi is not just a focus group or semi-structured interview. It's a very systematic, structured approach to getting expert agreement on complex issues with the key purpose of formulating a prediction, generating a set of priorities, or creating consensus guidelines, for instance. Next slide. So you may ask, in our field, how can we all practically use Delphi methods to gather patient experience data? In addition to generating clinical guidelines or parameters for defining a target population, Delphi methods can also be helpful in identifying concepts of interest early on to determine what your endpoint and research priorities should be in a target population. If you're interested in developing or modifying a COA, a Delphi panel can be helpful during the item reduction phase of the psychometric evaluation phase of developing a tool. And lastly, an emergent area of relevance is in the establishment of meaningful change. Delphi panels can be used as a useful method to confirm and or establish meaningful change thresholds, for instance, of progression or improvement. Given the multiple contexts of use, I'd like to highlight that the Delphi method is often best used as a complementary component of a multi-method approach to add to the totality of evidence that we can leverage in integrated evidence packages for multiple stakeholders. Next slide. Given the progression of the field toward using the Delphi method to establish meaningful change, I wanted to highlight here one example of this approach using a study conducted by Dylan Trundle and colleagues at Roche. The main objective of this study was to establish a threshold for meaningful progression on the MDS-UPDRS Part 3 in an early stage Parkinson's disease population through clinical expert consensus via a modified Delphi panel. And as background, the MDS-UPDRS Part 3 is a clinician-rated assessment of motor signs commonly used in clinical trials. Establishing a threshold for meaningful progression was important for progressor-based endpoints, and previous anchor-based analyses were conducted to estimate an existing threshold of 5 points. For the study, a sponsor research blind multinational panel of experienced expert clinicians was recruited to complete an online survey anonymously in 2 rounds. And the overall study design is shown in figure 1 of this poster. Round 1 explored initial opinions on the threshold for meaningful progression and differences between medication state, disease state, and treatment status. Round 2 was conducted in 2 parts, with section A being an aggregated overview of round 1 results, followed by a question on agreement for the threshold of meaningful progression. And section B was an overview of prior anchor-based analyses, followed by an evaluation of agreement that the threshold for meaningful progression off medication state lied in the range of 4 to 6 points. A high consensus threshold of greater than or equal to 70% was also set. The results from this study proved to be useful to support previous findings and establish a threshold of an increase of 5 points for clinically meaningful progression on the tool in early stage Parkinson's disease. Note that the Delphi method wasn't the primary means for confirming a meaningful change in patients for their trial though, but it was useful, efficient, and complementary of other data sources being used to drive conclusions. And while this research was helpful, there are 3 main limitations I wanted to highlight. First, they provided background information on existing anchor-based estimation research during round 2, and that could have influenced the level of agreement in section B. Second, only 2 rounds were conducted, and a 3rd round could have helped demonstrate that the consensus was maintained. Third, while the research was conducted as an anonymous survey, rather than permitting panelists to openly discuss, some panelists may have become aware of the participation of other panelists via interactions outside the study. Next slide. All in all, to wrap up, I wanted to highlight there are many advantages to using Delphi methods, as well as limitations, as you can see on this slide. Advantages of the Delphi consensus method are that it's a structured system of communication for clear results. In fact, the systematic nature of the Delphi method and controlled feedback can be a strength. Also, incorporation of anonymity helps ensure you have unbiased responses. And the Delphi method can allow flexibility with engaging a diverse group of geographically diverse experts. It can also lend to time and cost efficiency in the eDelphi method, for instance. Some disadvantages, however, include that there's limited open discussion, precluding open idea exchange and dialogue. There are also multiple rounds of input, which are required, and it requires time commitment, sometimes resulting in expert disengagement. Lastly, interpretation of study results are highly dependent on responder expertise, so careful attention has to be given to the panel selection phase. And with that, next slide. I'd like to thank you for your time, and I will hand it over to Holly to continue with our case study examples.
Great, thank you. I'm getting a error that I can't start my video because there we go. Thanks, the host. All right, sorry, my video, everyone. Okay, so I'm next slide, please. Great. So I'm going to talk about some specific examples today of Delphi methodology and hope that we can use these examples to generate some discussion about how they can be integrated specifically in this context of trying to understand what matters to patients and in some cases to caregivers. I'm going to talk about some caregiver related studies as well. We just heard from Ebony on the strength of the Delphi approach and some of its challenges, and I'm going to reinforce those as well. The Delphi approach, as Ebony indicated, is particularly strong when what you are trying to achieve is a consensus. So that really is the objective, is coming to consensus. And when you want really controlled and defined inputs. So I'm going to go through two examples here that give some nuance around how this can be done in different ways. I want to start by saying, though, that while Delphi has many strengths, this is not an approach that I regularly use for patient engagement, patient experience, and preference research. And I'm going to tell you a bit why during these presentations, and we can talk about that more in the Q&A, though, again, it does have a lot of strengths. So in this particular situation, we were looking at whether care guidelines that had already been developed using a Delphi process that mostly engaged clinicians, whether the recommendations that came out of those care guidelines were patient-centered. And so in this situation, we very specifically used a process where the people involved in the Delphi were patients and caregivers only. And that is because, again, our priority was to understand patient-centeredness. And we used a method that I'm going to talk a little bit more about. It's one of those modified Delphi approaches that Ebony indicated. And this is a study that I collaborated on with folks from RAND who originated the Delphi process and the modified process. And in this case, we really specifically were attempting to develop a patient-centered method that could be used for Delphi outcome generation across different contexts. And again, the participants in the panels were patients and caregivers. And, we know, I think from research and also just sort of intuitively, that patients and caregivers may differ to some extent in their preferences. And again, literature does back that up. But by having smaller panels that were more homogeneous, we were able to offset some of the challenges that often come up in Delphi panels when you have large panels that are mixed and have patients, caregivers, for example, expert clinicians, for example, individuals from industry, all on the same panel. So for this use case, we really tried to keep the participants on the panels quite focused and targeted. Next slide, please. So just quickly, there's a reference here. So I'm not going to go in any great detail into this process. And it's pretty similar to the process that Ebony described. The Delphi really does follow a pretty similar process, whether it's adapted or not. The real adaptation here is you see in round 2, that there is a component where there's discussion and feedback. So this was not an anonymous process. This was a process where participants on the panels did have discussion with each other. This was an electronic process. We were working in a rare disease, and this is a condition that not only is it rare, so it's hard to get people collected in one place, but also it's a condition that as people get older, causes a lot of issues with mobility. And so it's very difficult for many people who are adults with Duchenne to travel. So we really wanted to come up with an approach that was both feasible, but also really quite targeted to the needs of our community. And so this, all of the rounds were electronic, and this round of discussion as well was done using virtual forums. But the other assessments are quite similar. We have idea generation in round 0. We have an assessment in round 1, and the focus again here was on the acceptability and patient-centeredness of existing recommendations for care. In round 2, there was group discussion around how people had rated in round 1. And then finally, in round 3, we had a reassessment. And again, those are pretty standard components of Delphi, as you saw from Ebony. Next slide, please. So just a little, I think people sometimes Delphi feels quite broad. And so this gives you a little bit more detail about how do we get this evidence? And this was in round 1. And this is an example of an item that people saw as they participated in this process. And the focus here is on importance of a clinical recommendation and the acceptability of a clinical recommendation to people with Duchenne and families of people with Duchenne. And so here we ask patients and caregivers both to do a numerical rating as well as do some open-ended responses about why they answered the way they did. Next slide. Then we had the discussion that I showed you, that middle round where we had the discussion and people had a chance to think more about why they answered the way they are, did some discussion with other people about answering. We brought them back. And when we brought them back, we actually did some different techniques to try to keep people really invested and involved in this process, and to think critically about where they put their first rating and then give them an opportunity to change their rating along the way. And we did that by showing some different infographics that we pre-tested ahead of time to try to get people understanding where they put their rating. And you see here, oh, you can't see my screen. So item here, this individual chose 7. And you see the blue bar shows you where the most people had responded. And then there are the box over there on the right indicates the rationale that different people had given for the way that they had rated this item. And so it allows them to kind of see the collective inputs of the group. And then there is the final round of the ratings. Next slide, please. And this just gives you an example of the output. So again, the goal of doing a process like this is to come up with a consensus or a recommendation. And so the recommendations here were, the output here was whether these specific recommendations in this care guideline were patient-centered. And so these are scored with importance and acceptability. There were 2 panels, so we have scores for importance and acceptability for each panel. And then there was a final determination about whether each of these recommendations were patient-centered based on those inputs. So that's in that final category. So just again, trying to make this look a little bit concrete for you all about how this process is used. Next slide. And so we ended this process with a set of considerations for people who would like to consider doing an online modified Delphi approach with patients and with caregivers. And you can, again, the references here, and you can look at these yourself if this is something you think might be of interest to you. But I want to reflect again on a couple of things that Ebony brought up, that this is a quite time and resource intensive approach that really does require expertise in the research team to be able to make it work seamlessly, and especially if we're adapting in any particular way, like we did in this panel. You know, the other things I think is really challenging is for people to engage well in Delphi, it does require capacity building. And so we built that into this process, but it does require a lot of attention and care from investigators to ensure that we are giving the respondents everything they need to be able to feel comfortable and give their full feedback. And we also have to keep them engaged over time in a process that has multiple rounds. So there are some challenges there as well. All right, next. I'm going to show you just quickly one other example. And this is an example that does include a panel that is a mixed panel. It had patients, clinicians, pharmaceutical company representatives, and regulatory representatives. And this is a recent example that I was not involved with. And those of you who are involved in the study may be on this webinar. So thank you for allowing me to use your example here. But their objective was to build a core outcome set for this condition called von Willebrand disease. And they used a modified structured consensus process as well. Next slide, please. And so just to give you, this is my last slide, just to give you a quick overview of how this was done. One of the things that can become extremely challenging when we have mixed panels, well, there are a couple of things, is managing a couple of challenges in terms of how we integrate patient input with with clinical experts, for example. And the way that those become challenging is, number one, as we again know from lots of studies, different people from different backgrounds have different priorities. And so those priorities come through in the Delphi, and it's hard to know how we manage priorities when we have multiple different groups. We also have a different experience base. So, you know, clinicians and patients have different experience, both important but different. And then we also can get problematic power dynamics, even if inputs are anonymous. And so the way that this investigative team and some others have dealt with this is that they actually weighted the patient input differently than they did the expert, and had different score criteria for retaining or eliminating based on who had provided the input. So I encourage you to look at this process. There are, I think, really important ways that we need to adjust processes to ensure that the patient voice comes out. And the final, the bubble chart here just kind of shows you the output again. And this output is around these outcomes that they are recommending be included in clinical research in this context. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over, and I think we're going to move into the panel discussion.
Yes, thank you, Holly and Ebony, for your reflections from the non-regulatory space. And as a reminder, if folks have questions, please place them in the Q&A box, and we will answer some of those at the end of our session. I invite the rest of our panel to turn on their cameras, and I think we're going to switch to the panel view here. And so I see Rob, Selena, and others joining us. Thank you for joining us today. And I'm going to quickly introduce our other panelists. So Eleanor is a consultant and caregiver. We have, oh, I don't see folks yet, but hopefully you all are. Rob is joining us from Delphi Values. Selena and Wei Meng are joining us from the FDA, and welcome again to Ebony and Holly. So I'm hoping that everyone will answer this first question. Can each of you come up with a question or a context where you think using the Delphi method would be an appropriate method to use? Tell us a little about why it is appropriate and why it might be challenging. Rob, maybe you can start.
Sure, thanks Laura, and thanks Holly and Ebony for those great presentations, which I think introduced the topic really well. And yeah, when I'm thinking about where Adelphi might fit, your presentation brought it really well. That I'm definitely thinking of places where we're trying to narrow our focus rather than think broadly. So not so much the concept elicitation, where I'd see it as we're trying to capture what is the broad experience of disease experience for our target population, but rather where we're maybe situations, as you highlighted, such as finding a core outcome set or establishing a hierarchy of endpoints where we're going, we've got all this information about all these many concepts which we could measure, but which are the most important and how should we measure them? And so I think that's what I've been thinking about. And yeah, the example I wanted to talk about a little bit more was meaningful change, which you did illustrate well in one of the examples, which I've done a number of studies where we've been trying to capture the patient perspective of what is meaningful and what's a meaningful change threshold for a clinical outcome assessment. And I've done that through in-depth qualitative interviews, which might be standalone interviews, or we've also done it through in-trial interviews, which is really great for having an in-depth discussion with the patient and helping them to understand the difficult concept of meaningful change, and then being able to understand the different ways, the reasons why they might consider a change meaningful. So it's great from that perspective, but the downside is sometimes you do get, if you've got a sample of 30, 40 patients, sometimes you do get a wide range of responses. And some patients are saying, well, it's 1 point change on a 10-point scale. Any tiny change is really important to me. And others are saying, well, no, I've got to move from severe to mild, or it's not going to make any difference to me. So how do we marry that? And clearly the Delphi, as you described it, illustrated, it can help us to try to come to some consensus and come to a narrow range of values at least, or maybe even a specific value that everyone can agree on. So I think, to me, that's a great area where it can be really valuable. In terms of how it's difficult, I think Holly brought it out really well, that it's a time-consuming process, clearly, and it's one where you need to train the patients and help them to understand what's going on if you're doing it with patients. And so that's going to take a lot of time and resources, and will need a lot of careful planning. So I think that needs to be, and I also think it's important. It would be important to have a large enough sample of patients that what you come out with might not be biased by just a few perspectives. So I think that's something that needs to be thought about very carefully, and get that large enough sample as well.
Okay, great. Eleanor, do you have some thoughts to share?
I do. I think I agree with a lot of what Rob said about the uses, but I think one of the things I'm going back to is something that Ebony said, which was how it's complementary, and that it's not going to ever be the one way that we're going to do something and the magic bullet, but it's very complementary to for concept elicitation, for item refinement. And I think it just helps us in a lot of ways sometimes to understand why might patients disagree on something. Maybe it's wording, maybe it's terminology, maybe it's phrasing, and that if that discussion takes place, that can happen before our next round. That understanding that comes out of that can really be useful. It's also useful to understand why stakeholders might have differences in their voting, and again, that discussion among stakeholders about why they may be phrasing something differently or thinking about something differently can really help in interpreting why those differences happen. So I think that's one of the really useful things that Delphi in a structured way could be used for, to help make decisions in the long term that are not based on, well, one patient said that they were against this, or someone was against that, or there was a group that voted in one direction versus another direction. The one thing I think that was also mentioned is that when you do have patients who are in that mixed situation, you do have to have the right kind of environment for them to be able to vocalize, to feel not to feel intimidated, not to feel like they are not going to be able to contribute in the way that the other experts in the room are contributing, and for them to feel confident that they are experts. They're just experts in a different way than the others in the room, and should be voicing their opinion.
Great. Thank you for that. Selena.
Thanks, Dorley. Again, I also want to thank Ebony and Holly for their presentations, because I think it did provide a good background of the DEPA methodology and potential ways it can be used. I think from a regulatory perspective, I do want to make an overarching statement that I don't think the message here that we want is that Delphi methods should replace any of the typical methods that are currently being used to collect patient experience data. I think ultimately, the research objectives and questions should inform which method should be used, which was, I think, clearly stated in on one of Ebony's slides. I do believe that the Delphi methodology may be appropriate in scenarios in which you need to gather, expert opinions or multi-stakeholder input on a topic where there is no clear consensus, limited research data, or high degree of uncertainty. For example, the Delphi methodology may be appropriate to use to identify core concepts or outcomes for a disease condition. In the scenario, it can be used to identify the most important concepts to measure in a clinical trial for a particular disease or condition and or treatment, which is briefly mentioned in patient-focused drug development guidance 2. But that's not discounting, your qualitative interviews and your focus groups. Those are still, probably the bread and butter in terms of getting that in-depth information regarding that as well. It can also be used to achieve consensus on a set of core outcomes for that disease or condition, which was shown in one of Holly's case examples. Delphi methodology may also be used to identify components for a multi-component clinical trial endpoint, specifically to identify or select what components should be combined into a multi-component endpoint for a particular therapeutic area. It may also be used to achieve consensus on the importance of each component. And saying that with these scenarios, a multi-stakeholder approach should be taken, which should include patients and or caregivers, depending on the target population. And for me, what's challenging about this methodology, I believe, is selecting the appropriate panel composition to maintain that patient centricity. Oftentimes, we see an imbalance of contribution from patients and or caregivers. Another challenge is the consensus process itself. It can sometimes be difficult to achieve consensus among the Delphi panel. And this is why the study should be designed to have a systematic process with clear guidelines on how to reach those well-informed consensus. And this includes the adjudication process, which should be carefully considered and clearly outlined in the study protocol. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Selena. Wei Meng, do you want to add some comments?
Thanks, Laurie. Yes, I do. Just to build on Selena's comment regarding identifying the components of a multi-component endpoint. So well-developed and conducted studies using Delphi methods can be part of the rationale supporting weights of the components in the multi-component endpoint within the clinical trial setting. Multi-component endpoints often integrate disparate components such as scores from different COAs or scores from multiple subgroups of a single COA, or responses to individual items or tasks that makes up a single COA together into a single composite rating. All multi-component endpoints are inherently based on some form of weighting, whether implicit or explicit. For example, some endpoints assume all components have reasonably similar clinical importance. For instance, when averaging scores across multiple clinical outcome assessments. However, their relative importance or the weight of each component may not always be empirically evident due to the limited data. The Delphi method is one way to systematically gather input from multiple collaborators, such as patients, caregivers, or clinicians, and leveraging their knowledge and experiences to prioritize those components. That said, there are also considerations associated with this approach. As we heard earlier, there are several limitations or challenges of the Delphi method, such as limited open discussion or consensus pressure. Well-developed and justified Delphi studies should consider the procedures to mitigate the potential limitation. I'll talk a few limitations and highlight them here. For instance, selection of weights. The Delphi process inherently relies on the judgment of panelists, which can reflect their personal perspectives, priorities, and experiences. While this point may not be easy to mitigate, it's important to acknowledge the potential influence of individual opinions and generalizability of the weights, ensuring a diverse panel composition that includes important collaborators. For example, a balanced number between clinicians and patients, caregivers, and individuals from varied demographic backgrounds can enhance the generalizability of derived weights. Consensus difficulty. Reaching consensus among a group of people is always hard. The consideration is what kind of rule or criteria may be in place to help achieve consensus. lack of quantitative validation. A study using Delphi method standing alone is not enough to ensure fit-for-purpose weights and a good scoring algorithm. It is important to plan other studies, such as empirical testing with clinical trial data. As Ebony and Eleanor mentioned before, this is complementary information. We also heard the idea today that using Delphi method to help understand the clinical meaningfulness of treatment benefits. I want to emphasize that we are open to well-justified methods. However, established methodology discussed in the FDA PFDD guidance series should remain the primary source of evidence. For example, quantitative approaches such as anchor-based methods or qualitative approaches like exit interview remain critical. These methods, as outlined in the PFDD guidance series, provide a robust framework for assessing meaningfulness. Sponsors are encouraged to incorporate multiple sources of evidence to create a richer, more comprehensive context for evaluating treatment effects. Thank you.
Thank you, Wei-Mong. And I want to now circle back to our presenters. So Holly, what are your thoughts on the question? And let me know if you need me to repeat it.
No, I don't. And I mentioned early on that this is a method that I don't always go to as my #1 method. And I have to say that participating in the prep for this and hearing all your perspectives, I'm becoming more interested in adding more Delphi into my toolkit as a method I more regularly use in this context, right? In this context of understanding what matters to patients and families. And I agree with the group. I mean, to me, really the hallmark approach would be to use this in a situation like outcome measure selection, because I really do think that this is as other people have said, this is a complementary method and really works well when there are existing data. But those data are either conflicting, or if the data are not targeted for the purpose, or if they're not prioritized. And so this, I really do think something like outcome measure selection is an excellent case, because it does bring together existing evidence and pull it into an approach that can be result in an outcome that is consensus-based, and that includes multiple different views. So I agree with the rest of the group that these are very appropriate and strong uses. And I'll just end by saying one thing about the fact that there is usually limited discussion in Delphi. I like that as I did some additional review of the literature for my example cases, I'm seeing more and more times when people have mixed panels that they do have an engagement-based approach where the panelists have some direct communication with each other. And I think that's really important for both having a really robust Delphi, but also because, as many of us know, patient engagement has benefits that extend beyond just the kernel of the work we're doing in capacity building on both sides, and in really giving people a much more holistic understanding of the lived experience of people living with rare and common conditions. So I would also advocate for more of these Delphi approaches that include more of that real engagement as part of the process.
Okay, great. Ebony, what are your thoughts?
Yes. I mean, I echo the sentiments of the rest of the panel in terms of the multiple areas that this is useful. And I've highlighted in my slides, you know, it could be COA refinement, item refinement and development, meaningful change, as well as concept elicitation. But I wanted to focus mainly on the COA item refinement, because I think, you know, we automatically have a portion of COA development that would include expert opinion, whether it be patients or clinicians. And, you know, particularly if you have different items that may need to be reduced or retained. So the Delphi panel process could be very useful in achieving consensus and having that robust evidence to support why something has been retained or removed from items. I would say that a big challenge of things, particularly as it relates to panel selection, is getting the right individuals, the right proportion of individuals with the right expertise, but also those that may not necessarily have, you know, an influence that would override the rest of the panelists. And I think that that becomes an issue that we see on some of these panels where you have particularly strong personalities, or you have individuals who are really well established in the field where there's deference toward them even. And so it's like a forced consensus when in fact there might be disagreement. So you might not have the most accurate assessment of true consensus in those panels. So you have to manage that very well at the beginning when you're selecting your panelists, and getting broad opinion from multiple colleagues on who might be selected for a Delphi panel is highly encouraged, because once you select the panelists, then not to say you're stuck with them, but once you select the panelists, you're going to be moving pretty quickly with the process, given how time intensive it is. So you have to give a lot of thought at the very beginning on who you would like to weigh in on what's important.
Great. Thank you all. Any additional final thoughts now that you all have heard from each other? All right. Moving on, I have another question for you all. How do you see the patient voice being incorporated into the Delphi process? Some of you all touched on this before. So Eleanor, I'm going to turn to you because I know you have experience here, and then I'll ask if others have thought.
Sure. So I want to just kind of have us take a step back to remind us what patient engagement is, and actually trying to capture the patient voice. It's really making sure that we have some patient representatives who are participating in actually helping to articulate the research question, helping to help design the study, helping to come up with the questions or statements that are going to be part of the focus group, part of the Delphi panel, making sure that we've got them engaged and involved in that early stage, and that their patients are not just viewed as the participants on the panel, the study subjects. We've got to separate that out as who's a participant versus who's actually engaged in the research itself. And so it's really important to think about those patients that will be engaged up front. They won't be participants. They won't be answering the questions. They won't be part of the Delphi. They'll be part of the team helping to put it together. That helps to be sure that the statements that get put together, that get articulated, are articulated in ways that the patient participants in the long run will be able to answer them in development. There's no guarantee that a handful of patients who might be involved, or even a larger group that might be involved, will make the statements perfect or completely understandable, but you have a less risk that you're going to have problems. And we already know that it's going to be difficult for patients because of their illnesses, because of the range of patients that will be participating, to do something like this. So beginning with having patients engaged in the process helps us to ensure that we've made the whole process more acceptable to patients. That's a really important distinction that we sometimes forget about, because we're collecting data, and this affords the opportunity for us to collect data from larger groups of patients. But if we don't begin with patients as part of the process, we still might not be getting very good data in the long run. And so there's an important distinction to think about in making sure that patients are really engaged. One of the things I want to also point out in terms of a Delphi is that we very often will begin with a literature review, and that we'll be getting our information from evidence that comes through that literature review. And I also want to remind everyone to think about the fact that sometimes when you're looking at older literature, especially older literature, the literature can be wrong, because patients were never engaged in that literature. They were never engaged in those studies. And so studies that went on quite some time ago that focused primarily and heavily on clinical endpoints might have been focusing on clinical endpoints that patients just don't care about. And so it's really important to have patients engaged in the process to be able to help us distinguish what's really relevant and what's really not relevant and of importance to patients. And it's an important consideration when you're starting at the beginning.
Great, thank you. Do others have thoughts on this question? Rob or others?
Sure. Yeah. No. I guess to me, it seemed part of what seems great about Delphi is in terms of getting involvement of the patients, is it does afford that opportunity that they can be there as equal participants alongside the clinicians in a way that if you were, say, doing an advisory board or focus group that you would be very nervous of having patients and clinicians in the same group, because that point that clinicians could really dominate and patients might feel intimidated to argue with this expert who's had many years of medical training. So I think if you do set up the Delphi as anonymous, as a sort of fully anonymous, and there is the scope there that they can be equal participants, but still acknowledging the points that I think several have made, that you do, though, to do that, you've got to make sure you design it very carefully and provide them with enough training and enough opportunities to ask questions to the researchers that they truly can be full participants in that. So I think there's an interesting, it was into the point Holly made about the value of discussion. I can see there's a payoff there between how much you keep participants completely anonymous versus allowing that discussion and interaction, and there's pros and cons there that have to be carefully considered depending on the specific research question and situation. But potentially, I think most Delphis are done electronically using remotely, and so potentially both of those could still be done if that discussion is maybe not verbal, but it's through instant messages, say on a platform or something like that. So yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunities, and yeah, the other part to me is that you don't have to have, again, if it was just say a focus group, you don't have to have just a few patients. You can have a large group of patients so that you can get the diversity of making sure you have a range of severities and both a range of ages, both genders included, and then the Delphi can accommodate that fairly easily without it being too big an impact on the timelines. So
great. Anybody else want to?
I want to add on to something that Rob said, because I think one of the advantages is that opportunity for discussion, whether it's anonymous or not, because sometimes these happen, these can be in-person discussions, but more recently they're mostly through an electronic process. But I think that is the advantage and the complementary aspect of Delphi, is that there is that discussion. And I think also patients can still be intimidated in those discussions, even though they might be anonymous or they might be electronic. But I think with proper training and preparation for the meeting, they can actually actively participate and overcome that barrier.
I'd like to add one more thought too on this, which is the challenge that we put in front of patients who are expected to be the voice of their entire community, which is a high ask. And so reinforcing the need for this to be a complementary approach that builds on other evidence that has already been generated. And I would say especially they're thinking about, the way I think about it is that my patient, whether it's my patient advisor or someone who is participating as one of only a few patients in a process, needs that evidence to support their own assertion of what's important for the community. We should, just like we wouldn't expect a clinician to know what's important over a patient, we also shouldn't expect a patient to know what's important for everyone else. So just to reinforce that this is an approach that is very complementary and particularly useful when we already have an evidence base that, for example, that patient expert could use to advocate for the needs of their whole community.
And it's an opportunity too, because the same way that we might have the expectation that this handful of patients or small group of patients is going to be the voice of the whole community, and that's an unreasonable expectation, we also might tend to overreact when one person out of a group doesn't like a word, or doesn't like a concept, or and everyone becomes potentially overly responsive to the response of one person. And the Delphi is an opportunity for us to kind of pressure test that with a group and get some response back. And perhaps it's one sensitivity that one individual has, and we don't need to be overly responsive to it. But the other patients in the group can help us tease that apart.
Yeah, and I mean, the only thing I would add, I agree with every points that have been made by, my fellow panelists. I think patients should be, and caregivers, if that's the disease of interest, should be actively involved in the study and provide their perspectives and experience on the topic of interest, just to keep the study patient-centric, as I noted, as well as be contributors to the Delphi panel. As I previously mentioned in the former question, we oftentimes, when we see Delphi studies come in with submissions, we see an imbalance of contributions from patients and or caregivers, meaning no patients or caregivers or a limited number of patients or caregivers are included on the Delphi panel. And so that's why when we advise sponsors on these studies, we ask them to carefully consider the composition of the Delphi panel and incorporate the relevant stakeholders, including a sufficient number of patients or caregivers to be able to address the intended research objectives and questions. Keeping in mind that, maybe the research question may not be mean that you need to have, half the panel to be patients, but it, being relevant to the question that's being addressed or being studied or under investigation for that particular study. I do also want to reiterate the fact that, Delphi methods is just another tool in our box. It's not meant to replace any of the, the typical or traditional methods that we have been used to capture the patient voice. But if it is submitted, we do look at it, we try to give advice and determine whether or not it's the appropriate methodology for that sponsor to support their research objective.
Okay.
And there are methods for that, for adjusting for that imbalance when it happens, when there are fewer patient experts than other experts. And we've seen that in a number of Delphi panels, published Delphi panels, where there have been rules that have been worked into, in advance, a priori rules that are worked in that if something is highly rated by patients, it stays in the list. It doesn't get bounced out even if it doesn't meet that 70% threshold or whatever the threshold is. And I think Holly, the Clearfield example that you presented did that. The Center for Medical Technology Policy used to use that methodology all the time, that if a patient voice was prominent and it met a certain particular threshold, they kept that in. It was not taken out. So even when the numbers are in an imbalance, the things that are important to patients can be kept in.
Okay. Thank you all for that robust discussion. Any other thoughts before I turn us to another question? Okay, Selena and Waymon, can you elaborate on what the challenges are from a regulatory standpoint when you're reviewing Delphi studies? Selena, maybe you can kick us off here.
Sure. So the challenges I see when reviewing Delphi studies are, one, FDA input is generally sought late in the game, meaning the study has either already started, it's near completion, or it has been completed, and FDA just has not had the opportunity to even comment on the study itself. And this can be an issue because we may not fully understand the study's regulatory utility, especially if there's a lack of clarity regarding the research objectives and questions that the sponsor was intending to address. Or we may not agree with the method that was selected to address the research objectives or questions. In other words, there might be a better or more appropriate method to address the intended research objectives that we weren't able to discuss with the sponsor. So just a plug, if you are thinking about doing a Delphi study before you even start, come talk to us early so we can give input. The second challenge is when the sponsor does engage FDA early, but provides no or limited detail regarding the study, including its objectives, the methodology and analysis plan. So believe it or not, we sometimes get submissions that do not include a study protocol or even an analysis plan, or we receive submissions that may only include a protocol synopsis or just a high-level summary in the briefing package. So we don't have access to a full study protocol or a detailed analysis plan to even provide concrete recommendations. Lastly, as mentioned in the previous question, sometimes the studies just have no or limited patient engagement or representation on the Delphi panel, which may make the results difficult for us to interpret as it does not include or even reflect the patient experience. And so I'll let Waymon sort of give her challenges that she sees when she reviews.
Thanks, Selena. I would like to echo what you just said regarding the lack of details in some studies. As a statistician, my review primarily focused on the quantitative evidence. So I would like to highlight areas where the Delphi method and other quantitative approaches may overlap. So we see lots of proposals on deriving meaningful score differences for evaluation of meaningfulness of treatment benefits. For example, we see a single meaningful change score based on the PRO-based endpoint that is informed by a combination of qualitative research, which might be the Delphi method, and the quantitative methods. However, the lack of transparency about how the Delphi method was designed or implemented often raises concerns. The study results and conclusion can only be useful if there is rigor in the study design. Otherwise, it won't be interpretable. For example, were there procedures in place to ensure that patients' voice were meaningfully included in the final decision-making process? How were the panel members' opinion translated into actionable metrics to inform the clinical meaningful change? How was the Delphi study result triangulated with other quantitative or qualitative methods? Given the use of different methods, what is the rationale to decide on a single value as the meaningful change threshold? Without a robust and rigorous study design, information generated in the end will be challenging to interpret and likely will not be useful. So also I want to reiterate what a few points I mentioned before. A study using Delphi method standing alone is not enough to ensure fit for purpose of a COA score or understand the clinically meaningful treatment benefit. I want to emphasize that the established methodologies discussed in the FDA guidance series should remain the primary source of evidence.
So the key takeaways, if anyone wants to know those is basically come talk to us early, give us something to react to. Without nothing to react to, it's kind of hard to give you advice and recommendations along the way. I do want to also stress, providing what your strategy is, what your development, and to support your development product. If you are going to go this route, we're not telling you to choose this, but if you are going to, make it clear so we know to give you sound advice in terms of whether or not we see regulatory utility in that approach.
All right, great. Thank you all. And maybe one last question. Actually, it's not the last question when I say, I just looked at the time. So, we've talked and there has been some back and forth. I think you all have tried to make it clear that while we FDA are having this meeting and we have a session here on Delphi methods, it's not that it's a support of this method over other methods. It is one of the questions and one of the ideas that came out from that RFI, but also it is something that we are starting to see more of, and that there's been this expansion to say kind of what can it be used for. But what I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong, is it's not that we're supporting Delphi methodology over other methods. I think I've heard each of you say pretty clearly that this is complementary, and it might be that you have a research question, that this is the way to help get the evidence that would be needed to give that overall rationale that you're trying to put forward. So did I summarize this correctly? Do you all have thoughts on this? Other ways that you may want to say that?
I would just add that I think it's a newer, it's not a new tool, but it's a relatively new tool in this arena. And that having a new tool in our toolbox is welcome, because there isn't any one way to do this. And we need to do some more work on understanding what it can contribute and how it can contribute. But you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. When you have an opportunity to try a new tool, or at least a new tool in our realm of work, because it's been around for a long time, you take advantage of that opportunity and you figure out where it can plug in. It's not going to substitute and take away all the other the qualitative work that we do, the survey work that we do. It can't do that, but it can complement in a lot of ways. And it really depends on the disease. It depends on the question. It depends on what you're relying on it for, because sometimes it's to clarify something that you think you learned during interviews or focus groups, but maybe you need to figure out how to flesh it out a little bit more or in a different way. So I think the answer is it's not going to be everything to everyone, but it can be an opportunity.
Yeah. And I would like to add to that in terms of being that this is being viewed as complementary, this method does have tremendous strength in the context that we've all discussed. And I think opening up the discussion from a regulatory perspective is proof that there has been progression in the field to be open to these new and novel methods, particularly as we all work in this very complicated area of medical product development. And you run into varying cases where you have a lot of heterogeneity, you have pediatric conditions, you have different aspects, different disease severities that change over time, throughout the course of a trial. It's very important to have a lot of different tools in the toolbox to help refine conclusions and to really guide even the hypotheses that we have to help us understand the benefits of treatment. And so I would say that, I commend FDA for focusing on this particular topic, because it has not really been robustly discussed within the context of medical product development. And because of that, that's why we're seeing so much variability in the context of use. So I would say, we can really take from this and continue the conversation to see how best to refine in different use cases.
And I would really love to see one of those kinds of use cases be around how can we make it most acceptable to patients so that they can and will participate in Delphi panels? Because these are complex. It's not easy to do. Not everyone has the computer sophistication they might need or the technology that they might need. So there will be hurdles, and we don't want to end up having it be a biased way of collecting data. We want it to be a tool that helps open up opportunities, not close opportunities.
Great. Any other?
Can I just add one more point, Morley?
Go ahead. Sure.
And this is just giving a shout out, I guess, to our patient-focused drug development guidance 1. It's about method selection, right? You need to select methods that can appropriately address the research objectives and questions. And so if you want to choose the Delphi methods, you need to show us, hey, this is how it's addressing this research objective question, because there may be other methods that are more appropriate to use that can address your question and your objectives. And so at the end of the day, the research objectives and questions should inform what approaches you use in your research.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I do want to remind folks, and I think it's been mentioned, I'll mention it again. We do have 4 methodology guidances that are out right now. And guidance 1 discusses this and this theme of trying to match up your question and the methodology. And that's part of what we need to really understand. And so I think today, a lot of the sessions that you're hearing this afternoon in particular are really trying to focus on the methods that are coming in and the considerations and limitations that we want folks to be thinking about, and that we hear from our community members that we want to be thought about when you're using them. So trying to match it up and figure out the best way forward to answer the really important questions and to have that patient-centric focus is really important. So thank all of you all for answering those questions. And next up, I want to ask, we had somebody in the audience mentioned that one challenge they've had with Delphi is getting the people to actually show up when you have the meeting. And can some of you all talk about some of the strategies that people have used to ensure that everyone shows up for the panel? Like, this is something that also happens when you have focus groups, and it happens anytime you got to gather people. To happen today, right? I'm sure. So tell me, kind of, what are your experiences with this? Sure, go ahead, Eleanor.
For patients, it's making sure that they're compensated. You know, that if they're showing up to get some gift card that's a small amount on the gift card, there's probably less likelihood that they're going to show up. But if their compensation is reasonable for their time, and prior to the preparation and as part of the preparation, prior to the meeting, there's a discussion that helps them appreciate the importance of it. And if the patient participants really understand the topic and have an appreciation for its importance because it's important to them, then they're more likely to show up. And I think that that is also reflected in terms of having patients who are part of the team, because they will help you to craft the language that helps other patients understand the importance, and the importance to them individually, the importance to their family members. And that usually also is a way of making sure that patients are dedicated enough to the topic and it's important enough to them that they're going to make the effort. But patients very often cannot show up if they have to be at work or have childcare problems or things like that. So those are hurdles that we have to face in all of the research where we want patients to participate. And I think that it's just a part of doing business.
Can I add something to that? So I agree. I think it's a challenge actually with any time we have a longitudinal and relatively burdensome. This is not a unique Delphi thing. It's a longitudinal, relatively time-intensive activity. So again, don't let that scare you away from Delphi if you have experience with other methods like this. I think that I'm going to reinforce a few things that Eleanor said. I think critically, if you want patients involved, it really is making a value proposition to the patients and the patient community. And the best way to do that, like Eleanor indicated, is to start working with patients from the beginning. And so the first example I provided in Duchenne, we developed the entire project with a patient advocacy organization, and we had patient and advocate advisors through the entire process. And they reinforced, it's one thing to hear from the research team, but it's a very different thing to hear from the advocacy organization how important this study is for a particular reason for our community. And so I think that level of investment and engagement is a real key to keeping patients and families involved through a process. And then just to reflect on another thing that Eleanor said as well is making sure that we're developing, especially when you have mixed panels, making sure we're developing an approach where people feel respected and heard. And, you know, no one wants to participate in a process time and time again where you feel like your views are discounted. And so if you are voting against a particular recommendation that a patient made, having some flexibility and having an investigator go back and explaining why that happened. Things like that can be really important for maintaining investment through the process.
I'd like to also emphasize the importance of picking the right design, right? So as I discussed earlier, there are key techniques and elements that you can incorporate into your Delphi panel that could make or break the study, and particularly around retention and recruitment. You have to make sure that you're being patient-centric and patient-friendly, but participant-friendly as well, even with clinicians, making sure that you're designing, you know, the survey questions in a way that's not overly burdensome, being very focused in terms of your research objectives and questions that you want to actually answer through the study. And then also making sure that you're evolving to adopt very respondent-friendly methods, particularly around like using reminders, you know, whether it be through text message, phone calls, emails, the way that we would normally try to, you know, remind folks about their visits, et cetera, adopting some of the standard practices that we have to ensure that we maintain interest and also want to keep, you know, them focused on what we're trying to accomplish. I think that's going to be key. And I also would say that with the evolution of all the digital mechanisms that we can use, this is a very simple thing to integrate into your study methodology. And having even asynchronous online type surveys is very helpful leading up to a discussion, So really just modifying things so that you understand who your audience is. And one last thing around, the patient population, particularly when you're thinking about the severity of the condition, matching up the study design and the key techniques with what will be easy or more palatable in the patient community is paramount. So making sure that you're not adding burden where you can, reduce it is really key, specifically in those more severe patient populations where they don't have tolerance for long meetings or, different things that are intense, et cetera.
So Rob, it's looked like you've had something to add as well.
I think everybody covered every point, which it was a similar point that I think we have to think for some populations, recognizing that a patient may not, if they have a flare that day, they may not be able to sit for an hour in a discussion, or even sometimes we want it to be longer, right, 2 hours. And so, just exactly what everybody was saying of matching up, thinking carefully about that population and what might work for them. Maybe it's electronic where there's flexibility about the timing of when the individual provides the input could work better. But then also equally conversely, for some older populations, say for example, the electronic may not be so good and they might prefer the in-person and so on. So I think, just being really thoughtful about that, I think is pretty key. But I'd also definitely echo what Eleanor said right at the start of giving reasonable compensation does make a big difference to patients too, and that I think that shouldn't be neglected. And sometimes we can get caught up with sponsors having to meet fair value levels when actually giving a bit more compensation to really value their time is important. And so I think that should be thought about too.
Great. Okay, another question for you all. How integral is, and y'all have mentioned this before, how integral is the anonymity to the Delphi process? So, there might be group discussion between rounds, there can be different situations, but what have you all experienced with respect to panelists being assured that their votes and rankings are going to be anonymous? And is that an assurance that you all think is something that's needed? Ebony, do you want to start us off with that?
Yeah, I can start with that. I think, anonymity is one of the core foundational components of the classical Delphi process, but I think that maintaining some level of anonymity is important, particularly with the earlier rounds of response, because you want to try to circumvent the bias that's introduced with someone knowing that, oh, well, this key opinion leader who is well respected in the field has provided this response, and they feel like their response is known. That could truly impact the consensus process. So I do feel that it is quite important. But if you have that open discussion or in-person discussion, then some things will come out, obviously. But I think in the earliest rounds, it's very important for you to try to ensure that there's some level of anonymity so that others won't be biased in their perception of the responses, as well as the respondent won't be biased or won't, feel self-conscious about their responses when they do get in the room.
Great. Do others have anything that they want to add?
I think I would just say that in terms of something like anonymity, that's one of the things or one of the aspects of Delphi that I think we could be talking more to patients about and testing more to really understand from the patient perspective. Is that something that's important to them? How would it be important to them? And not just anonymity, but other aspects too, when we're introducing this to them and we really don't know very much about what their overall reaction is going to be to all of the different thresholds, rules, responses that they have to give, and how they participate. I think anonymity could very well be very important to them, given that they might feel like they're not the expert in the room. But I think there's a lot of things that we could test and really understand better. That way we can accommodate patients better.
Okay.
Yeah, and the
Thank
only
you.
thing I also add with that, I agree with everything that Ebony and Eleanor has said. Is also, if we're talking about including the patient and making this patient-centric, it may give them a level of comfort of wanting to contribute and being more open to contribute. So I do agree that, you know, some level of anonymity should probably be established in the earlier rounds.
Okay. We have 30 seconds if there's any burning thing that people need to say. All right. Thank you all so much for joining us from around the globe today. And thank you, everybody else. I think now we can transition to the qualitative and embedded interview session. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for the presentations and rich discussion. I want to note for those watching that when the presenters are providing their presentations, you can resize the presenter and slides by sliding the bar in the middle of your screen to make the slides larger. We are now going to move on to our next session, qualitative and embedded interviews. This session will be moderated by Ms. Sarah Stothers. Ms. Stothers is a clinical analyst in the Division of Clinical Outcome Assessment in CEDAR. I will now turn it over to Ms. Stothers.
Thank you, Ethan. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Again, my name is Sarah Stothers, and I am a reviewer in the Division of Clinical Outcome Assessment in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at FDA. We just heard a really great discussion about Delphi methodology and some of the advantages and considerations for using that type of methodology to acquire patient experience data and the utility of it for regulatory decision-making. In this session, we will explore the challenges and opportunities of qualitative and embedded interviews. I am joined today by several experts who have in-depth knowledge and experience in using and conducting and reviewing embedded interviews in drug development. We will have 3 presentations before we move into the panel discussion, followed by a Q&A session. Again, we encourage audience members to please submit any questions you have in the chat. So first, we will go into the presentations, but before that, I'd like to introduce our panelists, if they would mind turning on their cameras just briefly, and I'll go through. So first, we have Anna Kareen she's the Director of Patient-Centered Outcomes from Lundbeck Pharmaceuticals. We also have Dana Deben-Adeti, who's Vice President of Patient-Centered Outcomes Assessment from RTI Health Solutions. We have Dr. Emily Freilich, who is the Division Director from the Division of Neurology 1, Office of Neurosciences in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research here at the FDA. We also have Dr. Anyeka Ilov, who's the Lead Clinical Analyst in the Division of Clinical Outcome Assessment for the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, also at the FDA. We have Lola Rahib, who is Vice President of Translational Research Mission for CURE. And we also have Dr. Hilary Wilson, who's Director for U.S. Medicine and Regulatory Affairs at Boehringer Ingelheim Pharmaceuticals. And with that, I will let the first presenter go ahead. Panelists, you may turn off your cameras while the first presenter presents.
Thank you, Sarah. I want to start by thanking the workshop organizers for the opportunity to talk today about design considerations for in-trial qualitative interviews. Next slide, please. Throughout this presentation, I'll be talking about interviews with clinical trial patients and subjects and the patient voice. However, interviews in clinical trials also applies to caregivers and the caregiver voice. So I'm just going to be simple and probably call it all patient interviews. Let me start by talking a little bit about what we mean by in-trial interviews. These are the collection of mostly qualitative data from clinical trial participants designed to provide a better understanding of the disease and the patient experience, and designed to support COA-based and clinical endpoints. Interviews conducted with clinical trial participants is an evolving field of research, as you can see by the interest today. It's gaining recognition of the value and the importance of in-trial interviews and understanding the patient voice. Next slide, please. Let me start by talking a little bit about terminology. You've heard the term embedded interviews used today. However, there's no consensus on what this term actually means. In our work at RTI Health Solutions, we use the term embedded to describe one type of interview study, where the interviews are actually embedded within the clinical trial protocol. They're in the schedule of assessments. We differentiate this from a standalone interview study, where interviews are conducted as a standalone study. They're not in the protocol. This type of study requires separate site contracts for the interview activities, a standalone protocol and ICF, and separate IRB and ethics committee submissions. Next slide, please. Some additional distinctions in terminology pertain to the timing of the interview. You may hear people speaking of exit interviews when they're really talking about any kind of in-trial interview, but not all exit interviews are truly at exit. By definition, exit interviews should be when patients are exiting the trial at end of treatment or early termination. It's important to point out some additional terms used for describing interviews conducted at different time points. You may see interviews conducted at baseline or pre-study. These interviews are ideally conducted before receipt of study treatment. You may see interviews conducted at one or more different times throughout the clinical trial, either in addition to or in lieu of baseline or exit interviews. For example, you might decide to do interviews after a certain number of cycles of treatment. Or what I see more commonly is after week X, for example, at the end of the randomized treatment phase or at the same time of the primary efficacy endpoint. If you're collecting interview data at multiple time points, you are gathering longitudinal qualitative data. Next slide. As previously noted, in-trial interviews gather mostly qualitative data about patients' experiences, which can be experiences before starting the study treatment, which you see on the kind of the bluish boxes, as well as after receipt of treatment. However, it is possible to capture some quantitative data in the interviews, for example, satisfaction ratings or importance of changes. I want to point out, though, if you want to quantify most or all of your interview data, then a qualitative interview study may not be the most appropriate design, and you may be better off with, say, an exit survey versus a qualitative interview. Next slide, please. There are two key questions sponsors must ask when considering the inclusion of interviews in clinical trials, and we've heard some of this already today. One, what is your research question? What is it that sponsors really want to know? What are you hoping to address with the interview data? The second is, how do you plan to use the interview data? What will you do with it? What do you want to say? Has the clinical team really thought this through? Clarity on the research questions and the plans for how you're going to use those data are critical in designing interview studies and the methods to be used. Next slide, please. There are many good, valid reasons for including in-trial qualitative interviews, such as gathering data on patients' experiences with the disease and its treatments, their experiences with the investigational treatment, changes they've noticed since receiving the treatment, and the impact of those changes, as well as perceptions of meaningful change on key concepts or maybe measures. However, just because everyone else is doing it, or you think it's a good idea but you're really not sure why, are not really good justifications for including qualitative interviews in a study. Next slide. As you've heard today, in-trial qualitative interviews can provide an incredibly rich source of patient experience data. You can see from this slide interview data that can be used in publications, in regulatory decision-making, in reimbursement and HTA submissions, and even in communicating with other key stakeholders. Next slide. The next couple of slides provide an example of how data from an in-trial qualitative interview study can be used to support various activities. In this particular study, we conducted interviews with 35 patients with carcinoid syndrome as they exited a randomized clinical trial. The interview activities were designed to provide insight into the patient's experience and with this disease and with this study treatment, and to help understand whether reductions in bowel movement frequency, which was the primary endpoint, and other symptoms were meaningful to patients. The interview data were published in a peer-reviewed journal, presented at several scientific conferences, and most relevant to today's discussion, included in CDER's review of the sponsor's submission package. Next slide. On this slide, you will see one of the comments from CDER recognizing the value of the interview data. You can also see how the exit interview data supported regulatory and reimbursement activities in other countries. It's interesting that agencies in France and Wales use these qualitative interview data, even though we didn't have participants from those countries in the study. Next slide, please. Interview activities within a clinical trial require a lot of careful planning, and there are a number of factors to consider in both designing and implementing these types of studies. While all of these factors are important, I think the timing of when you're discussing these interviews and the timing of the clinical trial program are perhaps the most significant factors. How well these timelines align or don't will in part dictate the design of the interview activities, the methods, and even site, country, and sample selection. And actually, the timelines may dictate whether or not your clinical trial includes exit interviews at all, or any interviews at all. Next slide. There are a number of factors associated with logistics that need to be considered for these types of studies. Buy-in from stakeholders is one of the most critical ones, from senior management, regulators, your clinical trial teams, yes, indeed, your clinical sites, and your co-sponsor if you have one. Studies can be canceled or not awarded altogether because buy-in from stakeholders was not obtained early enough or not obtained at all. Having a plan for reporting AEs that may originate from the interviews is another important logistical consideration. We know of studies that have been canceled because sponsors did not plan for and could not identify methods for capturing AEs outside of the clinic visits. And timelines, as I mentioned on the previous slide, clinical trials might proceed without the interviews in them because the interview planning was introduced much too late in the clinical development program. Next slide. As I tried to demonstrate in this talk, in-trial qualitative interviews provide a rich source of patient experience data that can be of value to many stakeholders. To ensure the greatest likelihood of success with these types of interviews, it is critical to plan early for inclusion of the interviews in the clinical development program. Sponsors need to also ensure that adequate time is given to designing the interview study, developing the materials, and translating things that like the interview guide. Obtaining IRB ethics approval, and not just on the study level, but you have to consider the local or site level as well. And training your clinical sites ever before you can get into the field and see your first patient. I also recommend being mindful of your research questions. What are you doing and why? Again, clarity on the research questions and plans for how you're going to use these data are critical in designing these interview activities in your clinical trials. The timing of when to conduct or administer the interviews should also be considered and planned in context with your interview objectives, your trial design, and also the patient population. Again, if you've got a patient with significant fatigue or pain, conducting a 90-minute interview may not be feasible. And finally, deliberate and careful thought must be given to various methodological and logistical considerations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. Our next presenter could please turn their camera on.
Hello, everyone.
Go ahead.
Yeah,
We can
I'm
hear
just
you.
waiting for my first slide. So, hi, everyone. I'm Anna-Karin Berger. I'm going to present a case example on the development of a pediatric e-diary. So this is an outline of my presentation, the journey of the development and validation of the pediatric e-diary that will serve as a primary endpoint in our pediatric program, and where we used patient experience data for the development. It started out as a standalone qualitative study, collecting patient experience data to inform on the content and the design of the pediatric diary. But as the interviews had to close prematurely, we consulted with the FDA asking for a Type C meeting. And FDA came back to us and said that there were some clear evidence gaps that we could bridge by using patient-embedded interviews. So the last part of my presentation will focus on the exit interview study, where we continue the validation with gathering meaningfulness and patient burden to explore the reliability and the validity of the diary. Next slide. As I just mentioned, it started out as a qualitative standalone study where we did concept elicitation and cognitive interviews with children and adolescents diagnosed with migraine. And for the young children, we also interviewed their parents. The objectives of the concept elicitation interviews was to inform the e-diary content and make it relevant and meaningful to patients. The next step in the cognitive debriefing interviews was to explore participants' understanding of the diary and explore the feasibility of self-reporting without any assistance from their parents. All participants were stratified into pre-specified age band to explore the cognitive developmental stage and their language level. And down to the left, you have a table specifying the different age bands that we were targeting and recruiting. Participants were enrolled from 4 clinical sites in the US between May 2020 and July 2021. And all of the patients had a confirmed diagnosis of migraine. And to have a representative sample, we screened the participant on sociodemographic characteristics. And in total, we interviewed 8 children and their parents and 9 adolescents. The target sample was originally 30, 10 in each group. And next slide. The outcome of the concept elicitation interviews revealed that headache pain was the most severe symptom and reported by all age bands. Other core migraine symptoms were also confirmed by all age bands. And some symptoms was reported by a subset of children and adolescents. And these results made us to conclude that all symptoms in the ICD-10 migraine diagnostic criteria were covered and confirmed as meaningful with patients. So with this, we concluded that we had reached content validity. The cognitive interviews, on the other hand, they revealed that the youngest children had challenges with some of the items due to their developmental maturity, like complex questions about the medication intake and dose, etc. And the solution to this was to split the diary into 2, where children are to self-report core symptoms and impacts, whereas parents report the more complex questions, like headache duration or medication intake and dose. Adolescents, on the other hand, they clearly understood all items except aura. And the solution to this was to add a description of the aura diary question to have a clarification and a definition. And with the feedback, we concluded there were some minor revisions needed to both the child and the adolescent diaries. And to enhance the reliable self-reporting, we also needed to develop complementary e-diary video and additional training materials. Next slide. And after 14 months of recruitment, we ran into time constraints. We had pressed timelines due to agreements with regulatory authorities to start a pediatric program. And that actually forced us to stop the qualitative interview study prior to all age band having been filled. And because we were concerned that this is going to be our primary endpoint, we didn't dare to implement the diary until we had consulted with the FDA. So we went for a Type C meeting and seek alignment and feedback on the diary content validity. And the FDA actually did express a concern with the small sample, and they recommended further e-diary validation in the phase 3 through embedded exit interviews, and to also inform about the feasibility and burden of the daily completion of the diary, something that may actually impact on the data quality on our primary and secondary endpoints. So this is where we actually use patient experience data in bridging any evidence gaps. So now today we have in the phase 3 protocol, we have the implementation of the exit interviews, and the plan is to conduct 40 interviews with children and adolescents. And next slide. So to describe the exit interviews and the trial integration, the interview objectives in this round of interviews is to gather additional evidence of feasibility and content validity in the pediatrics, and especially in the younger age bands. We are also aiming to explore patients' perception of burden regarding the daily completion of the diary, considering that we are dealing with children and adolescents. The exit interviews are integrated in the protocol as an exploratory endpoint, and we decided that the interview should be optional. And the interview will take place within 14 days of the participant's completion visit. And the cohort is 40 interviews targeted in 8 selected countries, with 20 adolescents and 20 children. The interviews will consist of a 30-minute telephone interview by a professional qualitative interviewer in the local language. And some of the considerations we did for the country selections and to enable the cohort for the interviews was to offer the interviews as optional in all countries selected. And to make this decision, we actually revisited the optional consent rates in previous adult migraine trials. Another consideration was to explore the cohort being represented in each country, and also we looked into the representation of the different countries in the global trial. We also explore the planned order of country activation so that you don't end up with having all the interviews to the very last in the trial, starting late in the trial. And then per country evaluation, we explore the number of sites and number of enrolled participants for that country and site. And that was to secure at least 20% of children in the sample. Next slide. So this is just an overview of the interview guide and topics to be discussed with the children and adolescents. And it goes a little bit broader than what we had in the standalone study. It covers the overall clinical trial experience, what was most difficult or easiest to be part of a clinical trial. And then we are going into the logistics of completing the e-diary, if they fit into their daily routine, if it was difficult to complete. We also explore the patient perspectives and feelings about the e-diary, and if it's burdensome to complete. And also try to understand if there are any patterns to understand for any missed data entries. And then, of course, looking more into the content, we are exploring how patients perceive the questions and instructions, and also ask about the relevance and clarity of questions. And lastly, we are asking for any suggestions of improvements of the diary. Next slide. So to summarize, some considerations for planning standalone interview studies is to ensure that you have a representative sample in terms of socio-demographic characteristics. You would like to have a spread and diversity in your sample. You also need to consider how much your participants should match the clinical trial population in terms of the inclusion-exclusion criteria. And you also need to consider if you need to have a confirmation of clinical diagnosis, because that will influence the recruitment pathway if you're going to recruit patients through clinical sites or versus other sources like patient advocacy groups or social media. And that may impact on the timelines, which method you will use. For embedded interviews, you should consider the protocol integration, specifying the endpoint, the timing of the interview, and the cohort as well. You need to have a representative population of the trial participants and also define the enrollment strategy. You should also consider if you would like to offer the interview as optional versus mandatory in all countries or in selected countries. And the country selection should be, you did need to do a careful planning of country selection and also consider your geographical spread, and also the order of country and site activations. And you also need to remember that embedded interviews will follow GCP. So to summarize, well-designed standalone interviews can inform the meaningfulness and relevance of clinical trial assessments and endpoints and help to confirm content validity. You can also get some insights to reliability and feasibility around assessment and endpoints. And if you do this prior to implementation, this is a way to optimize your clinical trial data quality. And well-designed embedded interviews can provide insights on trial experience, patient burden, feasibility of procedures and assessments, and also help you to understand compliance and patterns of missing data, and also the risk of dropouts, which are important learnings for future trials. And you can also gain more further insights on patient experience of the trial population, on symptoms experience and treatment benefits and meaningful change. And one final good advice is to seek alignment with the FDA, especially for primary and secondary endpoints that you will have to support any label claims, and to perhaps be used for treatment benefit risk evaluation and to support regulatory decision making. And with that, I would just want to say thank you and express that we are very grateful for all the children, adolescents, and parents who participated in our qualitative studies, and to the Evidera team for conducting the standalone study and the exit interviews in the trial. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hillary Wilson, and I have a background in clinical outcome assessments and patient engagement, and have worked in medical product development for over 15 years, both in consulting and pharmaceutical settings. Today, I work at Boehringer Ingelheim, where I've led initiatives to more systematically integrate patient experience data in clinical development from our pre-start of development in humans through regulatory submission. Today, I'm going to present a use case of an embedded exit study that was used to substantiate interpretation thresholds for co-primary endpoints in a phase 3 program. Note that this was a case study that I completed while I was employed as a consultant at Evidera. I served as the co-primary investigator together with Robin Pokchavinsky, and the study sponsor was Palatin. Rob Jordan was the primary lead from Palatin, together with Pat Kuchaki, an independent consultant that was supporting Palatin with their overall patient experience and consumer research strategy for this phase 3 program. So on the next slide, Palatin was evaluating the safety and efficacy for bremelanotide for the treatment of hypoactive sexual desire disorder, or HSDD, in premenopausal women. The reliability and validity of the co-primary endpoints that evaluated change in sexual desire and change in personal distress related to sexual desire had been demonstrated to be acceptable. However, additional evidence was needed to substantiate the amount of change considered meaningful from the patient perspective, or the responder definition. On the next slide, I had been working with on the psychometric evaluation of the co-primary endpoints together with my late mentor, Dennis Ravicki, and Palatin approached us about designing and executing a patient experience exit study within their Reconnect phase 3 clinical trial program. And the great thing about working with Palatin on this study was that they came to us with very clear, specific objectives. This was something Dana referenced in her first presentation. This is just essential. And as a strong advocate for patient-focused drug development, I also appreciated that Palatin wanted to design this patient experience study with multiple objectives to really understand the holistic experience of what matters most to women with HSDD. Today, I'm specifically focused on the use case of the interpretation threshold data and how this impacted the FDA's review of the new drug application for this product. On the next slide, you'll see the study design of the exit study. It was a mixed method study where we had both a qualitative and a quantitative survey. The survey was 17 items, and the interview took approximately 60 minutes. We did combine both the survey and the interview data together with the co-primary endpoints to inform interpretation thresholds. In addition, we did lead some traditional anchor and distribution-based estimate analysis using the phase 3 clinical trial data on those endpoints. We combine the data in a myriad of ways to triangulate the responder definition. However, in the context of today's session focused on embedded exit interviews, I will primarily focus on the interview data. On the next slide, you will see the Reconnect study design and where the exit study fit within it. So the Reconnect program had a screening month, a placebo self-dosing month, and then there was a 6-month self-dosing period. And the co-primary endpoints were evaluated as change over that 6-month dosing period. The embedded exit study occurred after the final activities in the last study visit of the core period. So that was visit 9. Both the survey and the interview had to occur before optional enrollment into the open label extension. And women were invited to participate in this optional exit study at study visit 8. If they were interested, then the site staff completed the consent process at study visit 8. And this allowed the opportunity to schedule the interview with the expert interviewer at Evidera that could occur after visit 9 up to 7 days and before the open label extension enrollment. So at study visit 9, the survey was administered by site staff. It was a pen and paper survey, and then the interview was completed within 7 days over the phone. On the next slide, you'll see the sample size. So the Reconnect was a large program. They enrolled across the 2 trials, 1,202 women, and 856 of these completed the core phase. 242 had usable survey data, and 80 interviews were usable. All participants, including the clinic site staff and interviewers, were blinded to study treatment, and all of the qualitative coding was completed prior to unblinding. On the next slide, you'll see today we don't have time to go into all of the rich data that came out of this study. I do encourage you to check out the publication if you're interested, but I do want to highlight that increase in desire was confirmed to be the most important treatment impact by women in both the interviews and the survey, with that mentioned as the most important impact and target of treatment by over 80% of the women. The auto injector was also well accepted, and the women indicated there was a mixed preference. Some women had a preference for an oral daily pill, whereas others really liked the idea of an as-needed treatment so that they had less medication in their body. So this did provide evidence that there was a clear market position for this as-needed treatment option. On slide 8, you'll see some data around the clinical meaningfulness. Women that answered yes, overall, I benefited from the study medication and the benefit was meaningful to me were defined as exit study responders. So this was the first item on the exit study. You'll see that 59% of women in the bremelanotide treatment arm versus 27% of women in the placebo arm were classified as responders based on this exit study item. I mentioned we coded all of the qualitative interviews before unblinding the data, and then summarized the qualitative themes by treatment arm and by responder status. Active treatment with bremelanotide offered more extensive and multidimensional benefits beyond those reported by patients receiving placebo only. In fact, when you looked at the women in the placebo arm, they described either no benefit, no satisfaction with treatment, or they described a response, but it was limited to mental or psychological benefits, whereas women in the bremelanotide arm mentioned or used qualifiers that were much stronger around the mental and psychological benefit, and also described physical benefit as well. On the next slide, you'll see some of the quotes from women in the study. So in bremelanotide, you can see they're talking about experiencing a little heat, warmness and tingling, an increase or boost to want to do that, representing that desire and an indication that the treatment worked. Whereas in the placebo, in the top, you see a woman who was not a responder and says, there was no change in my desire. I was bummed about that. Or the next two describe emotional changes or psychological, but not any physical changes. On the next slide, in the exit study report, we overlaid the qualitative interview themes that emerged by treatment and responder status in the structured interviews for context. There's alternative approaches to using qualitative interview data in this context, but this is how we approached it in this study. In addition, we did report concordance between the exit study responder and proposed co-primary endpoint responder definitions. And as I mentioned, submitted traditional anchor-based and distribution-based results on the pivotal trial as well. The interview and survey exit study was cited in the multidisciplinary review package within the COA consult as evidence to substantiate the responder definition. And in fact, advice from one of the FDA COA scientists that reviewed the package and reviewed the exit interview and survey data contributed to the selection of the final responder definition that appears in the approved label. And then the next slide. I did want to just point out that there are alternative approaches to using qualitative interview data to develop interpretation thresholds. There's some discussion around using a mixed methods matrix analysis, or even developing anchors from the qualitative data itself and deriving change thresholds based on these qualitative anchors and having that be one of your input, that amount of change based on the qualitative anchors, your input into your triangulation process. These methods are emerging and there are no industry guidelines. I will say that, asking patients to estimate a hypothetical change is very challenging, especially when you're looking at multidimensional scales. Whereas asking participants that have just completed a clinical trial offers a superior approach because you're asking them to reflect on real change that they have just experienced. So these types of exit interviews embedded within a clinical trial context do provide a fantastic opportunity to inform what amount of change is meaningful from the patient perspective. On the next slide, I just want to thank all of the women that participated in the Reconnect program, as well as the exit study, as well as the Paladin team and consultant Patricia Kuchaki, and all of the members of the Evidera team, including Robin P., the co-investigator, Laura Sweat, the project manager, and all of the extended team that supported the project. If you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to myself or to Robin P., and her contact information is provided on this slide. With that, I'll pass it back to Sarah so that we can kick off the panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Hillary. And thank you, Dana, Anna, Karine, and Hillary for your reflections from industry on this great topic. It was a great 3 presentations. If all of our panelists could please turn on their cameras. And Hillary, yeah, thank you. If we can stop sharing the slides. Perfect. Well, thank you everyone for joining today. I just want to dive right into our first question. And I'm going to ask from the regulatory perspective. So I'm going to ask Emily and Onyeka this question. So how does FDA typically see embedded interview data used to support submissions that come into the agency?
Thanks, Sarah. I can go first. Sorry, my video is frozen. So from a clinical perspective, we really find that the interviews can be very informative for understanding the disease and to support choice of endpoints selection. As you've already heard, the interviews can really help us select concepts from the lived experience so that we can better understand the condition and what would a benefit look like to the patients or the caregivers. In neurology, we have a lot of very rare neurodegenerative diseases, and it can be hard to have natural history data or to really understand the progression of the disease. And so the interviews can really help us capture that clinical meaningfulness of a potential endpoint to see if it really is capturing what it's intended to capture. I think it's also used to help us understand the condition better and the trial experience from the patient perspective. It's just one piece of evidence that we use to help us determine that clinical meaningfulness piece that's so important for regulatory submissions. I think this also came up a little bit, but we would also use it in terms of the trial experience. You know, at the end of the double-blind treatment period, you can ask the participants if they know or what they think they were getting, whether it was drug or placebo, and that can help us really interpret the study results. If there was a side effect, that something like excessive vomiting or diarrhea, that might lead to what we call functional unblinding, where patients are pretty sure they're getting drug. And then we can match up the interview results and see if it's true. Like, were patients on drug more likely to identify that they were on drug versus placebo? And then that would question, you know, do we have to question the interpretability of the study results? So those are the two ways we use them the most.
Yes.
Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, I
Anka,
can
please
go.
go ahead.
Sure, sure. I guess I'll first start by, extending my gratitude to the organizers for the invitation to participate in this panel discussion. And of course, thanks to all of our presenters for their insightful presentation. So to, piggyback off of what Emily has stated, I would say that, we see embedded interviews used in a varied way, often in submissions. And sometimes these are often done by sponsors to address FDA's feedback on the submission. So I can think of several ways, and I would say that we see data from embedded qualitative interviews used to support eligibility criteria of a trial. So for instance, a sponsor may want to enrich their future trial population by requiring a moderate to severe disease symptom score on a peer measure that uses numeric rating scale. So data from embedded interviews that cognitively debrief the peer measure with the target population have been used to support the range of scores reflecting mild, moderate, or severe symptom on that numeric scale. So eventually supporting the entry criterion score that will be used in the future trial. I've also seen embedded interviews used to inform endpoint selection. I think, Emily, you said this, right? So based on input elicited from subjects about their pre-treatment experience with the condition, about their treatment history, about the concepts that are clinically relevant to measure. And these typically are collected during entry interviews or enrollment or screening interviews, if you will. So embedded interviews, qualitative data have been used to support either the development of a patient-reported outcome instruments, to support also the content relevance of an existing tool to the target population, or modification of an existing tool with the ultimate goal of demonstrating content validity of that tool in that specific context. I've also seen embedded interim qualitative interviews used to capture individual subjects' experiences over time. So typically this would be your interim qualitative interviews conducted at multiple time points throughout the trial. And these interim qualitative data also helps to identify adverse events or unexpected outcomes of treatment. One other way I've seen embedded interviews used is specifically exit interviews. I think our presenters have alluded to this, is to sort of complement quantitative data to interpret study endpoints. So for example, patients' input on what they consider to be a meaningful change on a global scale, or whether they believe they experience a meaningful change from baseline, have often been used to characterize meaningful treatment effect. So embedded interviews have also been used to provide benefit risk insight from subjects' perspective based on their experience during the clinical trial. And then finally, I've seen embedded qualitative data used to support patients' preference for treatment, such as their preferred route of administration and preference for palatability of treatment. So in essence, there are a whole lot of different ways we can have, I have seen embedded interview used in regulatory submissions.
Thank you, Emily and Yeka. That was great. I did want to pivot to the patient perspective a little bit. And Lola, if you wouldn't mind, I wanted to ask, since you're a representative of patient group, what are patients' experiences with embedded interviews?
Yeah, so at Mission Cure, we actually we have some experience with qualitative interviews. We used these types of interviews to develop core outcome sets for recurrent acute and chronic pancreatitis. And we had a pretty good response rate, and our experience was quite diverse in the sense that we had responses varying from long and detailed responses to short and concise. And some responses drifted from the question to highlight different things like systemic healthcare issues or their personal experience with diagnosis and treatments. But I think overall, these open-ended questions were extremely valuable to these patients for amplifying their voice and allowing them to share their experience and ensuring that their priorities are represented for clinical trials and clinical care.
And one question I had for you, if you wouldn't mind indulging me, is do patients find, participating in these interviews burdensome? Sometimes we worry about that from the regulatory perspective, but I wanted to hear more from you.
Yeah, I think in general, patients don't find these types of interviews burdensome. I actually think they love doing these because someone is listening to them. But also, I think making sure that the interviews are relevant to the patients and are meaningful to them is also very important, so they don't find them burdensome. Also, the interviews have to be not too long, obviously. Like the timing has to be right. And I think many patients value these opportunities. And I think the fact that when they feel that these interviews are contributing to improved care or research, even if it's not just for them, it's for others, I think they really they really value that and they're very willing to participate. But
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh no, so please finish your thought.
No, I was just going to say, having said that, I think sometimes we just have to be mindful of their health status at the time and the timing of the interview. I think those things can influence their experience. So just having a thoughtful interview process and design is very important.
Thank you. You kind of segued great into my next question, which is, what are some important considerations when you conduct embedded interviews? And maybe Anna, Corinne, you can start us off, and then I'll open it up to some of our other panelists.
Some considerations. There are on many levels. So start with the scientific questions. What kind of research question is it that you would like to address? So is embedded interviews the right forum for it? Do we need to interview patients with trial experience, or could we do that in a standalone study? And next to that is also important to consider the protocol integration and define the endpoint and some of the logistics around that. And also in this process, it's really important to have internal stakeholder management, so everyone is aligned on they're aligned on the approach. Otherwise, they could be quite complicated later on in the preparation of conducting the interviews or starting up. So those are a few of the considerations.
And Hillary, Dana, do you have anything to add?
I would also just add, Dana mentioned in her opening presentation, there's not really, a clear definition on what makes a standalone study or what makes an embedded study. The one that I presented today had some elements of both, but I think you really need to work very closely with your partners, which will include the CRO, as well as the study sponsor, to figure out exactly what is going to work best for you. As one example, we did have a separate protocol for this exit study, but it was referenced in the phase 3 clinical trial protocol. And then we used the same IRB that was used for the pivotal phase 3 protocol, and met, the Paladin team, the Evidera team, met with the IRB, which was Quorum, several times to talk about what's going to be the easiest way for us, to get these sites approved for this, and worked out a very seamless process where the Evidera team sent a weekly batch that included, this is the sites that we need. And then within 2 days, in the majority of cases, those sites were executed. So that I think you really have to think a lot about what's going to work for your specific use case, and make it as efficient as possible.
Yeah, and I think Hillary and Anna Karen have really hit the nail on the head, and I talked about some of the challenges and considerations as well. But once you have your research question and you know that including interviews in your clinical trial is the right thing to do, you need to decide in terms of the design, is it going to be embedded, which is always going to be easier to pull off, and it's also going to be more cost and efficient in terms of time and cost versus an independent standalone study. Your selection of study sites, your selection of countries, your sample size. Do you need to interview all patients, which in a large trial, that's just not feasible. If it's a rare disease trial and you only have 22 patients, then maybe it makes sense to try to get all patients or caregivers. Who's going to be doing the interviews? Someone mentioned earlier about the critical nature of having qualified qualitative interviewers conduct the interviews. That's a very different study design than if you want your study staff members to conduct the interview. That's a very different interview guide, and you're going to be answering different questions. And so forth. You've got significant budget considerations, and obviously timelines and so forth. So I think there are a lot of considerations that need to be thought about, which is one of the reasons I can't emphasize enough for sponsors and their CRO consultants to really come together early on. And if you are liaising with the FDA or other regulators to kind of have those discussions early on and continuously, because it takes a lot of work to get these things up and going. Even though it's in the grand scheme of an interview, I'm sorry, the grand scheme of a clinical trial, it's a small piece, but it's still a lot of work to get it up and going.
So you mentioned some challenges, Dana and Hillary and others, and I really appreciate it. So I want to go back to one thing and kind of put Anyeka a little bit on the spot. I'm sorry, Anyeka. I wanted to go back and just ask, if you do these in-trial interviews, how do you make sure that the blind isn't being broken?
I think it's different stakeholders, right? It's involved, right? So you want to ensure that in terms of the blind, when you're looking at your qualitative data, it's not affecting your endpoints, right? So the endpoints in your trials and all whatnot. So if you're asking patients like neutral questions about their disease experience or their experience during the trials, I think that, and of course done in a blinded fashion, I think to some extent that may sort of maintain the blind of that trial, as long as you're not asking them questions about the endpoints and the COAs and all whatnot. But I also would defer to our industry folks and see what do they see in terms of unblinding. But because I do know that sometimes it's easier said than done, and then we tell sponsors, oh, you want to make sure you ensure that the blind is maintained. But I think that one that is particularly tricky may be if patients are reports like, adverse events, right? And certain patients are reporting it. That I feel like that may be tricky. That may, inadvertently unblind your trial. So I don't know how sponsors have navigated that, but I feel like, neutral questions about disease experience and all whatnot, these things should not affect the blind of your trial, right? And you're not, talking about your endpoint tools. These should not compromise the integrity of your trials.
Any of our industry colleagues like to comment on this piece? Please go ahead.
Yeah, well, as an interviewer, I am always blinded at the time of the interview, unless for some reason it's an open label design. So I think, as Anna Karen and Hillary both mentioned, the timing of the interview after, let's say, the end of treatment, and I'll just use exit interviews for simplicity. So we're conducting it within a pre-specified window. So before they roll over, ideally to open label, or before they are unblinded. So I, as the interviewer, am always blinded. Even when I do my analysis, we are always blinded. So we do all of our qualitative analysis. We generally provide that to the client. Then after that, when database has been locked and cleaned, we might get select unblinded data, whether it's treatment assignment, clinical trial variables, and so forth. I do ask patients about changes they've seen. What changes did you see with treatment in this, and how did that impact you? And sometimes people will guess. I don't know if they're guessing right or wrong, and because that sometimes that goes into our interview guide, but that's very specific to the objectives of the interviews and that particular study. But most of the time we don't ask them to guess, but sometimes we do talk about COAs and we do debrief them and so forth. But as long as the interviews are conducted after the primary analysis data are gathered, so we want to do it after their end of treatment visit or the early termination visit, so that the interview data and just by doing the interview itself doesn't inadvertently bias the clinical trial data, which in my opinion should always trump the interview data.
And we as a sponsor, we let the work be conducted by this a vendor. And and we don't get the interpreted results until the qualitative report is ready. So we are kept blinded quite long after the completion visit. And yeah.
Hillary, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think in a lot of these cases, you do have a separate vendor that's conducting these analysis. So for the example I just shared, that variable wasn't shared with us until we had already completed all of the qualitative coding itself. And then we received a transfer of that variable so we could integrate it into and in the analysis and look at the results different by treatment group. But I mean, this is pretty common.
Typically, we get the results after the efficacy results.
Yes.
And report. So it's a delay of a couple of months. So we are kept blinded for a long time.
And one thing I wanted to ask the panelists, and this is mostly for our industry colleagues, but when would you choose not to include embedded interviews? Could anyone speak to that? Or why, some reasons why you may not choose to conduct embedded interviews? Maybe we could start with Hillary.
I mean, if you're in an accelerated program, these things do take a lot of time and, to plan. So if you really don't have the time to work through the operational logistics, then it's not going to be advised. It's something that comes to mind immediately. What do you think, Anna Karen?
I fully agree. And also, if you have a clinical outcomes assessment that you're not really sure if it's going to work in this population, it's not disease specific, and then you do the cognitive debriefing as part of or just asking questions of its feasibility or relevance, that I would do in a standalone study rather than in an exit interview.
Mm-hmm.
And just one more thing I would add to that is if you want to quantify and put numbers to everything in your interview data, then the qualitative interview may not be the best method for data collection. You might be better off with a survey. So, I mean, if you want the numbers of people who reported X, Y, and Z, you don't need a qualitative interview for that. The qualitative interview is going to provide more than X number of patients said this on satisfaction, I got this satisfaction rating. What we can get as interviewers are, well, tell me why you're satisfied. What goes into that satisfaction rating? Why, what would it take for you to go from being just a little satisfied to more satisfied? But if you want to put hard numbers on everything, then a survey might actually be the best method versus the interviews.
Thank you. And I did want to ask our regulatory colleagues, what are some challenges when you're reviewing the embedded interviews? I know we talked about the blinding issue and things like that, but I just wanted to hear from your perspective. If you could shed some light on that. Maybe we could start with Emily.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I think one of the challenges we see is that we don't always know that it's there. And so sometimes we don't know that the interviews have been collected or we're not expecting it. And then we get a marketing application and there's all this data there and we don't know what the intent of those interviews was. If we don't know how it was conducted or haven't had the opportunity to give advice on the timing of the interviews or how it should be done, then it's a lot harder to know what to do with it. So I think encouraging the sponsors to talk with us early, if they're planning to do interviews, what is the intent of the interviews? You know, what data are they trying to gather, so that we know ahead of time, can give advice if needed, and then we know how to use it when we get it coming in later.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Emily hit on something that Dana talked about when we were prepping for this, is just when not to do it is when you don't have a clear purpose.
Exactly.
You know, because a lot of times it's like, oh, everybody's doing these and we should do that. But if you don't have a clear purpose, that's not, it's not going to really get you anywhere, but add complexity to your trial where it's not needed.
Agree.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. And I would say that, you know, just like Emily has said, it just buttressed the importance of early discussion with the FDA. And this goes to say that sponsors should proactively plan the conduct of their embedded interviews as opposed to doing it in an ad hoc manner, right? So, so all of that. And then sometimes I feel like it's a little bit challenging when I don't get the protocol and the interview guide to sort of look at and evaluate how the study was conducted. So that could be challenging sometimes. So just encouraging that sponsors should submit their interview guide and study protocol for FDA to review. But also there are also other unique challenges, especially with the conduct of embedded interviews, especially due to the context in which it is collected. And most of these are just from a scientific point of view. And, you know, some key challenges that I would like to highlight would be, like, I think most people have said this before, is embedded interviews may not enroll an adequate number of subjects with relevant clinical and demographic characteristics to ensure that there's a representative sample of the target patients participating in the qualitative interview. So as such, this limits the generalizability of the findings. So just it's really challenging to sort of, oh, how generalizable is this findings when they have such few patients and whatnot. And then also another thing is, which, you know, it's none of these are just challenges from my own point of views, but I think, you know, none of this precludes the collection of embedded interviews. I actually find them very, very helpful. But another point is the potential for recall bias. I think this is more in certain cases than in other cases, as participants may not accurately remember or articulate their experiences, leading to unreliable data. I've also come across situations where it could be challenging to review data from embedded interviews due to lack of standardization in how the interviews were conducted, right? So I've seen a case where, the patients themselves were interviewing themselves. So it wasn't sort of standardized in that sense. There's also the timing of the conduct of the interviews, right, which could impact the data interpretability. So for instance, if you're completing the conduct of exit interviews during open label extension phase of a trial, that may be challenging to review and make meaningful interpretation of the data, given the potential for expectation bias due to subjects' knowledge of treatment assignment that may impact their responses, right? So another issue with timing is that sometimes sponsors would collect embedded qualitative data to demonstrate the content validity of a PRO instrument that is intended to support an key efficacy endpoint in their pivotal study. And that endpoint is supposed to support approval or support labeling claims, maybe is a key secondary endpoint. And then sponsors collect the embedded data to support the content validity of this tool right within their phase 3 pivotal trial. So this is challenging to review and make sense as opposed to if this was done in a phase 2. So you're collecting this data right in the middle of a pivotal trial, but how do we make sense of this data? So it feels like sponsors go in with this hypothesis that their tool will be content valid, right? And so it's better done if it's in a phase 2 trial so that we have, that clear interpretation. Then also we talk about how qualitative data may be complementary to quantitative data for the interpretation of meaningful change, but sometimes combining both data may be complex. So for instance, there could be an apparent misalignment between data from subjects' perception of change elicited during exit interviews, for instance, and data from subjects' global impression of change scales administered within the trial. So I've seen that. So a patient was administered PGIC, and the PGIC data show that a patient worsened, yet the patient is reporting improvement during exit interviews. So that discrepancy is like, okay, how do you combine this data? And then another example could be you would translating raw item level scores that subjects reported to be meaningful change on a target PRO scale during embedded interviews. And then how do we translate what patients have considered to be a meaningful score on that target PRO to a transformed total score of that scale, especially when we think of, the transformed score being a response pattern scoring. So I've seen that case. So sometimes combining all of this could be problematic and challenging to review. But basically, in all, I would say that the utility of embedded interviews is really important to help FDA make informed decision, and then sponsors should be able to mitigate some of these issues to a reasonable extent to ensure robust data is obtained from embedded interviews.
Thank you, Nika. That was very comprehensive and we appreciate that. Did anyone have anything else to add on this topic? Okay, great. I also wanted to go back to what are some approaches that may facilitate the generation of robust embedded interview data? I know Nika just touched upon some in detail from the regulatory perspective, but maybe I'll start with Lola to get the patient perspective, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, sure. So there's lots of things, but in concise, I'll say that involving the patients very early on during the design phase, I think it's very important, and it will ensure efficiency and that the questions are relevant and understandable and like reflective of the patient's experience and needs. I also think making sure that the patients know the value of their input. I think letting them know how their contribution will influence the outcomes makes them more willing to participate. And along those lines, I think reporting back to the patients after the interviews are done, letting them know how their input has made a difference, showing them the results in a way that they can understand and is meaningful to them, I think is very important. And yeah, so we can start with that.
Any of the other panelists have any comments? Maybe some of our industry folks.
Can you repeat the question, Sarah?
Yeah, it was just some approaches that may facilitate the generation of robust interview data. And I'm thinking more along the lines of like digital health technology, things like that. If you maybe could all speak a little bit to that.
I think I can continue.
Go ahead, Lola.
Well, yeah, sure. I think digital technology can really enhance the access and quality of the interviews, including like flexibility and convenience for the patients. Because a lot of times, these patients might have a flare up or they have medical appointments, so they can't really have a very hard schedule. So like this kind of flexibility is really good for them. Just being able to do things like asynchronous input through different apps or different digital platforms that allows them to respond at their convenience. Also, wearables and other mobile apps are also very powerful, I think, because they can track different things that are in real time. They can provide data in real time, including things like their patients' physical activities, their vital signs, sleeping patterns, stress levels, things like that. And I think you also get a more diverse population through digital platforms. If you're doing these interviews online, you can reach a much more diverse population, including those in remote areas that may not be able to come to a clinical site. And things like translation in different languages or transcriptions or visual aids and just ensuring inclusivity for patients who have different needs.
Thank you, Lola. That was a great perspective. I agree. I think it can be informative. Emily, I wanted to pivot to you. We had a question from our audience. The question is, one potential challenge with interviewing in-trial participants is spontaneous adverse events reporting, particularly if questions about treatment experience are asked. Are those adverse events expected to be reconciled with the side effects reported clinically at the individual level?
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, that's a good question. I think in general, we're not going to be going back and cross-referencing, that individual's data set in the, to make sure that if they reported a headache in their interview, that a headache is reported in the data set. I think that obviously if it's a serious adverse event, I would hope they would have told their provider. So we expect that we would capture, most of the important adverse events the traditional way. I think in general, what it can help us with is more what we spoke about earlier. If there's an adverse event that keeps coming up that maybe led to functional unblinding so that the patient knew they were getting the treatment because of that adverse event, or understanding missing data was also mentioned. If the adverse events led to them not showing up for their visits or appointments and things like that. So that's what we use the adverse event generation in the interviews for. We're not, going to go back and individually check, oh, did they have that included in their data set?
Dana, did you have anything to add? I know you took
Yeah,
yourself off mute.
I did. So I think for the large majority of participants who do spontaneously report an AE, they've already notified their site. But my job as an interviewer is just to be the messenger. So if they report something to me, I will ask if they've reported it to the site, but I'm still going to let the site know. And then the site we encourage the sites to follow the AE reporting procedures that are listed in the clinical trial protocol. I have on occasion, though, said, you know what, now that I think about it, my hair is thinning. Is that related to, the medication or the disease? I'm not the one to answer that. And that was new to the patient. And she had not reported that to the site. So I went ahead and reported it to the site. So we tell all of the sites to treat these as, potential new reports, but more than likely they have already been accounted for. The one issue I have run into in a previous study is that the sponsors did not have a way to accept these AEs that came from a vendor or from outside the clinical trial. They had a way to capture serious adverse events, but they didn't have a way to capture non-serious adverse events outside of the clinical trial setting. And they could not find a way to make this happen. So the whole study had to be canceled. The whole interview study had to be canceled. So it is an important thing to consider.
Did any of the other panelists have anything to add quickly? I know we're almost at the top of our time limit, but okay, I have one question, and I think I'm going to ask Anyeka. What is the best way this is from a question from the audience. What is the best way for sponsors to package in trial qualitative interview data for submitting to the FDA as part of a submission, an application submission?
Yeah, sure. Quickly, I would say that if the intent of the exit or the embedded interview is to support the interpretation of COE measures or endpoints, then you want to include that in a COE evidence dossier and submit that under module 5.3. If it's maybe related to patient experience data or something else, usually that still goes into module 5.3, but it could, or if it's used for some other purposes, then you may want to submit that data tied to the exact purpose for which it's submitted. But in general, most of the data from embedded interviews are usually used to, inform COE measurement strategies. And so that goes into an evidence dossier and submitted under module 5.3.
Great. Thank you for summarizing that. I think we'll wrap up early and let people get to their break unless any of the panelists had anything else they'd like to add. Well, thank you all for being here today. They were excellent presentations. And I will turn it over to Ethan, I believe, and he can get us ready for our break.
Great. Well, thank you again, everyone, for the presentations and for sharing your thoughts. As Ms. Stothers mentioned, we'll now have a brief break, so please be back at 3:30 p.m. Eastern. Welcome back. We will now be moving to our last session of the day, 2 hot topics, when to consider age norm scores and repurposing COAs for new uses. This session will be moderated by Dr. Michelle Campbell. Dr. Campbell is the Associate Director of Stakeholder Engagement and Clinical Outcomes in the Office of Neuroscience in Cedar. I will now turn it over to Dr. Campbell.
Thank you, Ethan, and good afternoon, everyone, and good evening for those who are watching from other parts of the world. I want to thank you for still staying engaged with us as we are getting late into the evening and towards the end of our agenda. But both of these topics that we're going to spend the next hour or so talking about are extremely relevant and are topics that we are handling and seeing in submissions to IND programs every day. And we thought it would be really important to have this conversation about the use of repurposing clinical outcome assessments for new uses and when to consider using age norm scores as a conversation piece for everyone collectively to hear what is currently going on, what perhaps is challenges and limitations to consider, and when there may be appropriate uses. And to keep you all on your feet, we're actually going to start with repurposing COAs for new uses. We're going to begin with a presentation from my colleague, Cheryl Kuhn, who is the Vice President of the Clinical Outcome Assessment Program at the Critical Path Institute. And she'll be introducing to us her thoughts on the use of repurposing clinical outcome assessments for new uses to support clinical trial endpoints. So Cheryl, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Campbell, and thank you everyone for inviting me to participate in this important workshop today. To set the stage for this discussion, I'd like to give you my brief perspective on the challenges related to using scales that were developed for use in clinical care, then repurposed for use in clinical trials. Let's go to the next slide, please. Before we launch into the challenges, let's first consider why we would repurpose scales from clinical care for use in clinical trials. First, and quite obviously, scales used in clinical care are available and ready to use, which can be a great advantage when a clinical trial is being designed and there isn't time to develop something new. Second, these scales are familiar to clinicians, and those clinicians are the ones serving as PIs and perhaps designing the studies. Using such scales might make site training easier. Third, when such scales are widely used, that means that there may be publications on them that would allow for comparisons of the new therapy to other therapies or to the expected course of the disease over time. And fourth, if the clinical trial is successful and the information on the scale goes into the label or publications, clinicians can then discuss those trends with their patients when weighing treatment decisions using metrics that they are familiar with and can communicate more easily with their patients. Next slide. Now that we understand the advantages of using scales developed for clinical care, let's explore a few of the risks. First, we should be aware that if a scale was developed to screen or diagnose a condition, it might not be great for measuring changes over the course of treatment because its items may be targeted for a narrow range on the continuum or the condition. For example, we might hope that people on a disease-modifying therapy will remain stable on treatment. We would expect the placebo group to worsen if it's a degenerative disease. If the items are all piled up in one location on the scale to diagnose that disease early, there might not be items to measure the condition as it worsens, which means the placebo scores might not have the opportunity to separate from the treatment scores. Next slide. Second, if a scale was developed without regulatory expectations in mind, it might not have the type of recall period, response options, or patient involvement in its development that would be needed for clinical trial use. This here is a rather extreme made-up example. If patients had been involved, they likely would have said that they don't use the term bradykinesia, and they'd prefer something more descriptive of their symptom in the words that they would use, like slow movement. A long recall period might work well in the clinic when changes are assessed year over year, but assessments are likely more frequent in a clinical trial where we want to track changes as they happen, and we need the recall period to match that assessment window. And it's tempting to provide many response options to delineate between states, but we need to make sure people see them as distinct from each other. Otherwise, they'll just create noise. Next slide. A third risk is that if the scale was developed without regulatory expectations in mind, it might not have its development evidence well documented for regulatory submissions. Maybe all the right steps were taken, starting with talking to patients through to longitudinal psychometric testing. But if the details like interview transcripts and psychometric data sets aren't available for regulatory review, then new evidence may need to be generated. Next slide. Finally, clinical outcome assessment and clinical practice and clinical trials have different goals. The goal of assessment and clinical practice is about monitoring each unique individual, whereas ultimately the goal of assessment and clinical trials is about comparing groups. The way a family doctor would assess physical or cognitive functioning in an infant is different than that in a toddler or in a school-aged child. But we have to use metrics that allow for us to compare apples to apples in a clinical trial setting. Next slide. I hope that you can see from this brief overview that there are indeed many good reasons for using scales developed for clinical care in a clinical trial setting. But the use of such a scale is a decision that needs to be made with awareness. Rather than just pulling a scale off the shelf and inserting it into a trial protocol, we must do our due diligence on the fit of the scale for the purpose of clinical trial endpoint construction. And with that, I look forward to the panel digging deeper into this topic so that we can all be better informed.
Thank you, Cheryl, for your overview presentation and to really spearhead our panel discussion. At this time, I'd like to invite my panelists to turn on their cameras, and I will briefly introduce you. To our audience, how we are going to be handling this session is we're going to be spending the next 30 minutes or so talking about the repurposing and reuse of clinical outcome assessments that may be primarily used in clinical practice and now wanting to be used into the clinical trial setting. So if you have questions regarding this is the time to be entering them in the Q&A and the Zoom box. Then we will have our next presentation on age norm scores, and we'll take the questions for that then. So please do, if you have questions on this one, go ahead and start entering them in, and we greatly appreciate it. So I'm so happy to have this esteemed panel together with us this afternoon, and please let me introduce you to them. We have Robin Carson, who's the Vice President of Patient-Centered Outcomes and Research at AbbVie. We have Cheryl Kuhn, who I mentioned is the VP of Clinical Outcome Assessment Program at the Critical Path Institute. We have Ricky Magrum, who's Director of Patient-Centered Research at Vector Psychometric Group. We have Bryce Reeve, who's a professor of population health sciences and pediatrics, as well as the director of the Center for Health Measurement at Duke University. And I have my FDA colleague, Marian Shazaria, who is a mathematical statistician in the Division of Biometrics 3 in the Office of Biostatistics in Cedar. So welcome, everyone. I know we've been listening all day and we have a lot of thoughts, but I want to really begin our conversation on the use of potential using of clinical outcome assessments that maybe were primarily developed for clinical practice, where that is actually where you see the most use of them from. We have experience with them. We may have an understanding of how they work in certain diseases and conditions. But I would love to hear your thoughts about what are your thinking about how do we approach this and leveraging the ability of these COAs in the clinical trial setting. So Robin, if it's okay, I would like to start with you with your perspective with the industry about how do you really think about when selecting an appropriate clinical outcome assessment and what is needed to demonstrate the fit for purpose aspect in the evidence to support our clinical trial endpoints.
Great question, Michelle. Something we grapple with all the time. And before jumping in, I just want to say thank you to the FDA for having this wonderful workshop and allowing us the opportunity to have these great discussions across multi-stakeholders. I think we're all learning and evolving together, and it's such a pleasure to be here. So thank you for the invitation. I think it's a constant struggle, right? And I think it starts with intention, and that's a theme I've been hearing throughout the day today, right? Making sure that you're thinking about the right research question and the purpose of the data and the decision that will be made. And I think that'll be a recurring theme, and certainly something we keep top of mind when we're thinking about a measurement strategy in the context of a trial. And we know that there are multiple decision makers, right? That ultimately first starts with the regulators, but then goes into payers and reimbursement authorities, then followed by clinicians, and then the patients themselves. And every step along the way, they need different different evidence to make those decisions, because their decisions are slightly different. And so I start with that context, because when we're thinking about the right measurement strategy in the context of a trial, we're considering all of those perspectives. And hopefully we've done our diligence to connect with individuals, whether it's regulators or payers, clinicians, and patients, to understand their perspectives, to inform it, with, of course, the emphasis on those outcomes ultimately being patient-centric. But one of the challenges we face is sort of, I'll call it shooting the gap, right? Of how do we create that sort of holistic measurement strategy in a way that uses those fit for purpose measures in the context of the trial, but to the extent it can, meets those other needs, right? To be efficient. There's only so many resources. We can only dedicate so much time from individuals and funding. And we want to make sure that we do that in a way that also allows for comparisons across treatment options. And so that comes back to the clinical practice tools themselves. The tools themselves, as Cheryl said, and you eloquently noted, are often easier in that we can take them, they exist, and we can take them and put them into our trial. I would encourage everyone to look closely at them for many of the reasons Cheryl stated. It's likely not a lift and shift ever. I don't think we've ever found that to be an exact fit when we take it from one context to another. It'd be taking a butter knife and trying to cut a steak with it, right? It's a blunt measure, a blunt tool, and probably okay for those individual decisions, but not for the precision that we need in trials. And as Cheryl stated, it's more about group level decision making in trials and detecting those group level differences versus those individual, very specific decisions made in practice. So we do see a lot of challenges. I think there's a lot of interest in using those for that continuity. And what I would say is, if we could begin thinking more proactively about what we've heard today and the great work of bringing in patients early, and understanding those outcomes that matter, we can think long-term about creating a measure for practice following the work that we're doing for trials, because I do think that the importance and the continuity can be kept if we have the linkages with the right concepts. But the way that you ask it, the recall period, all of that might be different and could be tailored to those individual decisions. We also just know that historically they've been developed by clinicians who are focused on those decision making and may not have had that training, right, in measurement science. And so we do know that there's a different level of evidence and scientific research required to get it to today's evidentiary standards. So I think it requires a close look, really focused on that right context of use to make sure it's going to be able to track those outcomes with the precision we need in a trial setting.
Well, thank you, Robin, for your thoughts. I think those are some really great thoughts that you have, and perhaps we'll get maybe a little deeper into some of those thoughts as the discussion continues. But I want to turn it over to both Bryce and Ricky, who bring in some different perspectives based on the stakeholder aspect that you represent. So Ricky, I'm going to ask you first, and then I'll go to Bryce about what are your thoughts about how do we really want to approach this, and what is the considerations to really think about from your perspective?
Thanks, Michelle. And I'm going to just echo what Robin said about how delightful it is to have a conversation like this about some nitty gritty and difficult challenges that face us in measurement. And I agree that I think there's a theme from today that pertains here, which is really about how, whether it's scale development or scale selection and modification, is this multi-layered, multi-method endeavor that requires input from a lot of stakeholders. That can make it seem, I think, really overwhelming. So I think one point that I would want to make is that I think that there is actually a lot that can be done by just looking very closely at the measure that you're considering itself. So there's some pragmatic things that you can do from the outset. And the theme that I have for this is content, content, content. So if you really closely examine a measure, it's often possible to understand a great deal about its adaptability and potential relevance to a trial design that you're considering. Does it include the concepts that are pertinent to longitudinal assessment or not? Is it scattered with all kinds of different response sets that are going to be scored differently and create all kinds of problems for you? Simple things like, is there a conceptual model or measurement model that matches the measure's content itself? And I really liked in Cheryl's slides the picture with all of the stacked up binders, because I think it sort of shows us that there is this layer of complex, replicated, organized, well-described evidence that you need to have that becomes persuasive and convincing us that this measure is going to do what we need. And so one of the first steps is to take that look at what is available and to get an idea of what, is it a small hill of evidence that you need to produce, or are you going to be having to build a Mount Everest of evidence, in which case doing a new measure may be easier.
Thank you, Ricky, for that. And Bryce, I'd love to get your thoughts on this topic.
Thank you very much. And I also extend my huge thanks to the FDA for allowing me to be part of this wonderful panel and a part of this wonderful conference. It's been taking a lot of notes today, so thank you. Working at Duke University School of Medicine, I had the privilege of both working on measures, both for clinical research as well as clinical practice. So I get to see the strengths and limitations of both approaches in terms of trying to make good decisions based on the tools that we have available to us. Looking over the field, there has been, examples of good applications of using measures that have been used in care in research settings. And we don't want, I don't think this panel wants to go away with the thought that you can't use a tool that was designed for clinical care for research purposes. And I think a lot of the comments made both through Dr. Kuhn's presentation as well as from other commenters there have highlighted some of the important key issues that one would need to consider. And that includes, are we measuring the right outcomes, and who is involved in measuring those right outcomes? And importantly, a lot of the outcomes are captured in the clinical care settings are those things that oftentimes are selected by those that are treating the patients. And that a lot of times those outcomes are likely very relevant to the disease or to the treatments that they're receiving there. But in addition, there are also those things that the clinician feels that they can take action on. So there's a chance that there's a more narrow set of outcomes that are captured by those particular measures. Again, given that the physician only wants to take action on those things that they need. Then we turn our attention over to the measures themselves. And again, Dr. Kuhn did a great job of showing some potential challenges that may occur, especially if these were sort of homegrown types of measures there, whether the response period, the recall period might not be appropriate, or is focused on a very narrow aspect of the whole length of the symptom burden or functional impact, or maybe they have a lot more response options or too little response options overall. Some of the things that I've seen in the particular field, which gives me a little bit of pause sometimes, is, and for very good reasons in the clinical practice settings, is that oftentimes they recognize that they want very simple measures, and oftentimes that results in a single question on a person's tiredness or fatigue, or a single question on their sadness, or a single question on their pain, which is really good in a clinical care setting as a screener to identify, most importantly for the clinicians, as like a triage, is this person in the area where I need to pay clinical attention to and help out? Is this person in sort of that yellow zone where I just need to sort of monitor their symptom level over time, or in that good level, so where they're okay, I don't need to really even talk about with the patient there. So under those simple type of screening types of questions, that they work really well for the clinical care setting. But the challenge is these single questions would not work well in a clinical trial, especially if you're using that measure as a primary or secondary outcome, where you really need to be able to pick up on signals of where they are at baseline and where their follow-up overall. The other thing that I think is a actually an advantage of using measures from the clinical care setting, is that oftentimes these measures are used in a much more heterogeneous population. So it needs to be applicable for a lot of different people. And oftentimes in research, we're a very homogeneous population. So there could actually be a strength of using some of those measures from the clinical care in the particular research setting. Ultimately, at the end of the day, what I think we're all sort of hoping will be at one point in the future is we do have sort of a regulatory grade measures used in the clinical care setting. And the advantage there is we can realize, oftentimes referred to as a learning healthcare system, so that measures that are used in a trial to look at outcome are also used in the clinical care setting to continue to gain information about how that treatment impacts these patients once that drug gets past the drug approval phase overall, so we can continue to learn in a research type of way. But obviously, integrating research grade type of measures there oftentimes can be seen as a burden on patients to be able to complete, especially if they're going to their care setting on a routine basis overall. So those are my initial thoughts.
Thanks, Bryce. I think that was really great and really, in the spirit of this entire conversation for those considerations. And I thought you highlighted some really great pros and cons, particularly the aspect of the intent in clinical practice may be something very specific. I sometimes equate it to the chief complaints. What am I in here today for? That's what's being evaluated, where in the clinical trial where we have diseases of heterogeneity, we're trying to maybe leverage multiple different types of COAs to capture that full patient's lived experience. And so perhaps that single question is not going to be that sufficient piece to capture that entire experience. So one of the things I think it's important for people to be reminded is that we are open to adaptation of scales to be used in clinical trials, because we know that it is time consuming and costly to completely develop de novo COAs. And so there is an openness to the adaptation of scales where appropriate and if it can be done. But I see that, and for what we see that's coming in, what I see as a reviewer in the Office of Neuroscience is a lot of times in some of these situations, when the fundamental things that is often missing was perhaps the qualitative evidence, and really that evidence from either the patients or from in a rare neurodegenerative disease, which I spent a lot of time in that world, in the family or caregiver perspective, really. And that's what is establishing our content validity and what we really need to really support why I'm measuring the right concepts. And so a lot of times it's just not there, as Cheryl stated, and Robin and Bryce and Ricky already said. The use is, oftentimes we're developed by clinicians for their use. So I want to start with Ricky, and then I want to ask Cheryl and Robin for their thoughts about, Ricky, can we potentially try to go back and build the evidence in a way, particularly on the qualitative side, to help support some of this stuff? And if we can, what are some of the things that folks should really be thinking about if they want to try to attempt this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that can be done, and it can often be done quite successfully. And the methods are largely the same. So you would still want to conduct some kind of concept elicitation that was open-ended and really just asked patients, what is it like to live with this disease? What do you want from treatment? And then what you have to do is also do a cognitive debriefing. And I think as part of that process, you need to pay close attention to really getting people to tell you quite a lot about their interpretation of each item. And then through a sort of semantic analysis, essentially, you're looking to see whether or not the population of people who are debriefing the measure are using the same kinds of language to describe the concepts that are in the measure in the way that the people in the concept elicitation study described the concepts that you identified. And when you synthesize this information together, you can reconstruct a support for items, or you can highlight where there are problems with items that might need to be addressed. And that latter problem is quite common. And I think one of the problems I've seen in my work with clinically developed measures is they were often developed at a particular hospital or a practice in a particular part of the country. They may have embedded language that is regional in nature and doesn't translate particularly well to other parts of the country or other parts of the world. And I've even seen cases in which measures embedded sort of assumptions about the way that people live their lives. So if it's developed in the Midwest, perhaps it assumes that everybody owns a car and does a lot of driving and goes, shopping in big grocery stores. And the way that items are phrased then can be very confusing to people who live elsewhere. And so having that sort of national sample when you are doing your cognitive both your concept elicitation and your cognitive debriefing can be quite important in this particular context.
Thank you, Ricky. So Bryce, I see your hand. Cheryl, are you okay if I go to Bryce first and I'll come to you? All right, so Bryce, what are your thoughts?
Oh, thank you. I didn't mean to skip line at all.
No, I saw your hand pop up and I was like, I must have something burning to say. So
we have a good example of this process. So we've been working with the FDA under the core outcome program to look at how we assess acute pain in newborn babies and young children. As part of this process, we were looking at ClinRO measures that are existing to assess the young baby's acute pain level. There is a multitude of ClinRO measures out there that have all been used in various shapes and forms in this young population overall, all built a lot by clinicians and used quite often, some more than others overall. And so to get to the issues, Michelle, that you had raised in your question is, we didn't feel the need, because there's a whole lot of existing ClinRO measures of acute pain out there, to go back and reinvent the wheel, because we should be using these. But at the same time, when we started to dig into the background of how these measures were developed, oftentimes there's that huge missing piece up front, which is, where did the information come from that determined what aspects of the child behaviors were associated with acute pain, and who was making that decision and process. So, and oftentimes all that information either never occurred in the initial qualitative interview or was never documented. So there is a lot of work to go back and backfill those things there to make it to assure that this measure is appropriate for clinical trials. The additional piece that we never found as well was also the cognitive interview part, to make sure that every single part of that assessment is both understood, clear, and valid overall. Again, missing part there that does take a lot of work to go back, and oftentimes those interviews reveal additional things that will be changed, which would be hard to do because these things are existing, copyrighted, and set in place.
Thanks, Bryce. I really appreciate you sharing an example. And I think that's a really great realistic example of the efforts that you're trying to do for a concept that is really relevantly important. And we don't have a good way to actually measure pain in infants. It's a struggle that we have. And so the attempts to try to find a way to do this and to be able to build that evidence so something could be fit for purpose is really important. And I do know what you've been working on, and some of those challenges have been faced. So I appreciate you sharing that, because I think those are a lot of lessons learned that a lot of people can take as we approach leveraging this, leveraging existing scales, particularly, in your case, you're talking about in a, the tiniest, it's the tiniest of the pediatric spectrum of patients, and those already bring some unique challenges. Cheryl, what are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, so what I'm thinking here is something that we grapple with a lot, or we have the opportunity to grapple with, I suppose, at Critical Path Institute, because we're bringing together sponsors who have tight timelines for their trials that are about to launch. We're bringing together patient advocates and the people who need the treatments yesterday. And so we just want to accelerate drug development as quickly as possible. But in that, we can't skip steps. And so often we'll start a conversation about trying to measure an outcome in a certain therapeutic area, and people say, oh, there are instruments that exist already, we're fine. Well, we have to pause there and do our due diligence, to use that word again, and do some sort of literature review to find out what evidence exists, what of those binders is already out there completed, but also just looking at the instrument and figuring out, does this thing have the viability to move forward? Or should we say, this is great for clinical practice in a clinical setting? The items can be worded in a way that if they're unclear, they can interact with their clinician, or if the clinician wants to dig deeper, they can have that conversation face to face. In a clinical trial setting, that would actually have the potential to bias the data because we want the same sort of measurement for every single person. There's a standardized process that we go through to make sure that the data that are coming out are comparable across people. So at that point, we might say we don't want to move forward with the qualitative work because this one is just not going to be able to be modified or used in a way that we're comfortable with. But we can still learn from that. There might be concepts and information that came out in the literature review that's our foundation for going forward and taking a different path for the qualitative work. And of course, I wish I had the PFDD roadmap here to point to, as there are different choose your own adventure arrows to follow, depending on what you find at each step. One other thing I wanted to point out, and I think Bryce kind of touched on this with the copyright, is that if you are going to pursue using a clinical setting instrument, and you know that there might be some modifications that need to be made, you've got to have that clinician, that copyright holder on board. And make sure that they understand, here's why. It's not a problem with the instrument. It's great in that setting. But in this new setting that we want to use it for, there are some alternatives that we need to consider. And are you open to considering that? Can we be partners in that together? That is a critical step, because if they're not on board, you might not be able to make those modifications. Or maybe they're dipping their toe in the possibility of the modifications, but as you start to make them, they don't want to move forward, which actually is going to take more time because you have to take a few steps back and maybe take a different arrow in that guidance roadmap.
Well, thank you, Cheryl, and thank you for mentioning the PFDD roadmap. I feel like the roadmap is a really great tool in this case to really help identify if there are gaps, where they are, and what are your options. And so, of course, I would always encourage folks to leverage the roadmap. Make sure you start from the far left part of it, because that is really where you need to start to help build that evidence. And really is this COA that you're selecting that is pre-existing and used frequently in clinical practice, will it be able to get through all of the evidentiary aspects that need to be developed? So Robin, I want to get your thoughts on that. And then with that, we're going to a little bit wind down this session. I'm going to ask Marian for her final thoughts, because she hasn't spoken, and if she has any perspectives on this, and then we're going to transition over to her presentation. But Robin, what are some of your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it can be done. And as Ricky very astutely noted, it's very similar methods, right? If we think about the evidence required for the context of clinical trials and regulatory decision-making, we have to make sure those are all in place. And so it's a really intentional review to determine whether, you know, you can adapt and fill those gaps, or if you need to pivot and develop new, because the evidentiary basis is the same. And I think the important thing that I really want to emphasize is that if we can confirm the concepts are the same, and we can or adapt and modify with permission, as Cheryl astutely noted, that is necessary with instrument developers, we have to also think about the reporter. Sometimes these are actually ClinROs, right, that were developed for use by clinicians, reported by clinicians, that are a part of a conversation, informed by their conversation with the patient, but they may not have been intended to be PROs. And so that also represents a shift to really consider in adapting it, whether those are better reported by patients in the context of a trial, which is really, you know, per the roadmap and the FDA guidance, the position, if a patient can, they should, on things that they know best. The other thing in both cases, whether it's a patient, caregiver, or clinician, we often, when we think about clinical trials, we have to think about implementation. And one of the gaps we've noticed in taking clinical practice measures into clinical trials is the lack of standardized instructions. Sometimes those just don't exist. We don't have those wraparound user manuals with all the documentation, but also guidance on how to train, how to ensure there isn't inter-rater, variability across clinical investigators, how to ensure maybe if it is an interviewer administered questionnaire, which some are in clinical practice, what are those guidelines? And so sometimes that's a gap we have to fill as well in collaboration with the instrument developer to ensure that we minimize that variability. And then lastly, thinking about implementation, there was a discussion earlier about paper. Certainly we know the value of eCOA. And so thinking about how you migrate it to those platforms when traditionally in clinical practice, it's being used often on paper, maybe in some more highly sophisticated systems now embedded in AHRs, but different nonetheless. And all of those considerations lead to making sure that we have the most high quality data, because if we are investing the time to get this right, we want to make sure we can deliver on the data and be able to share it back with different stakeholders to make their decision making. So those considerations are really critical as you're building out your evidence basis as well.
Thank you, Robin. And so finally, I'm going to turn to you, Marian. As a statistician, as another reviewer like myself, what are some of your thoughts, high levels for consideration for when we see this come in and we're being asked to provide advice? What is kind of your thoughts from kind of the measurement statistical aspects that you would be looking for?
Thanks, Michelle. So I think that I'd like to just start by calling out the patient-focused drug development guidance series that we have. That's always a really good resource for folks to start with if they don't know where else to start. I completely agree with a lot of what's been said by the panelists, and I just want to highlight and reiterate a couple of things. What qualitative and quantitative validity data are needed does really depend on the intended use of the scores. Generally, different validity evidence will be needed to support use in a clinical trial as compared to clinical practice. And even in clinical trials, what evidence is needed can also depend on how the scale will be used in a trial. For example, you could have it be used to help define study eligibility criteria as part of one of a set of comprehensive set of measures. It could be used to help report adverse events or as the sole basis for an efficacy endpoint. Those all require different types of amounts and types of evidence. And what I think a couple of people, Michelle, you and I think also Robin also brought up the content validity part of this. I think that is really critical. I think it's really important to make sure before you just pick a measure that's used in clinical practice, make sure it is actually measuring the right thing. And by right thing, I mean something that is important to patients. It's expected to move with disease status and respond to treatment, and that it's something, if patients can report on it themselves, then perhaps if it's a ClinRO, consider doing the work to retool it, as Robin mentioned. I do think that one thing that is needed to go from clinical practice to clinical trials that isn't often thought of is exactly something Robin just mentioned, which is